coercive measures, UCMs, undertook a fruitful academic visit to Cuba. We also had the opportunity of receiving in our country, last June, the Vice Chair of the Committee of the Rights of the Child. Madam Vice President, the economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed by the United States on Cuba is a massive, flagrant, and systematic violation of human rights of Cubans. Since our previous review, the blockade has worsened. It has done so significantly. This with the implementation of more than 240 additional UCMs. There has been a fraudulent inclusion of Cuba in the spurious list of countries that sponsor terrorism, a list drafted by the U.S. Department of State. Since April of 2018 through to February of 2023, the blockade has caused damages and harm to Cuba, estimated conservatively, I might add, at around $24.7 billion. At current prices, the accumulated effects over more than 60 years of blockade surpass $159 billion. During the COVID-19 pandemic, sanctions against Cuba, unlike the rest of the world, were strengthened, and they were strengthened deliberately to extreme levels. Cuba was prevented from acquiring pulmonary ventilators from subsidiaries of U.S. companies, and the same for spare parts and inputs for the industrial production of the very effective Cuban vaccines. Obstacles were placed before the acquisition of medicinal oxygen from third-party countries, and there was a demand made for specific licenses, or a specific license to do so from the United States. Just 13 days ago, the General Assembly of the United Nations, with an overwhelming majority, called for an end to this policy. It causes direct and indirect harm. It causes suffering, shortages, and anxiety for Cuban families. It is the fundamental cause of the scant supply of medicine and foodstuffs. This is even the case for the household basket, which is insufficient, but which all receive at highly subsidized prices. The blockade is the primary factor in the exorbitant prices, the devaluation of our currency and wages, and the exhausting electric blackouts, in the limitations on first need services, and this has negative effects on health and education. This is also a determinant cause in the migratory flows. In addition to the economic war, Cuba has been and is a victim of sustained media and communications campaigns. These are aimed at projecting an absolutely false image of human rights in Cuba, the goal being to subvert the constitutional order. This modus operandi was implemented with particular intensity in 2021. At that time, there was an attempt to force a destabilizing situation. There was a combination of extreme measures to choke the economy, with sophisticated actions aimed at manipulation, disinformation, and even non-conventional or cognitive wartime operations. These were generated from territory and platforms and technological platforms in the United States. Vice President, despite progress in Cuba since the last review, we aren't satisfied. We continue to endeavor to improve and to promote full dignity and full justice and to tackle current challenges. Cuba continues to hone its institutional and legal framework to protect human rights. Cuba will continue to promote a society that is ever more free, democratic, fair, participative, socialist, and one that shows solidarity. As recently elected members of this council, we will give the best of ourselves, the best and unyielding contribution from our country to dialogue and international cooperation in these matters. It is with sovereignty that we will move forward in our cooperation with human rights mechanisms within the United Nations. We will do so based on respectful and constructive dialogue. The international community will always be able to count on Cuba when it comes to defending peace and multilateralism, and when it comes to promoting the enjoyment of all human rights for all individuals. Thank you kindly. I thank the Excellency. I thank the Minister for his statement. We will now begin our interactive dialogue. I would like to remind you that the speaking time will be of 50 seconds for all. As usual, issues of political, bilateral, and territorial nature should be kept out of our deliberations, and the United Nations terminology should be used when referring to states and territories. Only the use of the words recommend or recommendation will ensure that the relevant parts of your statements are included in the recommendation section of the working group report. Allow me to also recall that the Human Rights Council strongly rejects any acts of intimidation or reprisal against individuals and groups who cooperate or have cooperated with the United Nations and its representatives and mechanisms in the field of human rights. We will now begin with a list of speakers. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Jamaica.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Jamaica congratulates the Republic of Cuba on the presentation of its national report. My delegation commends Cuba for its commitment and efforts to uphold and respect its international human rights obligations. Jamaica notes that the government has supported 226 recommendations from member states and implemented 215, as well as in an unprecedented move, approved over 100 superior legal norms in 3 years. We encourage the delegation to continue its cooperation and collaboration with the UN human rights machinery to advance national efforts in strengthening legal and institutional framework for the protection and promotion of human rights. Finally, we wish Cuba every success in this 4th UPR cycle. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Japan. Thank you, Madam Vice President. Japan notes the efforts made by Cuba since the previous cycle. This includes the adoption of decrees and strategies that are related to the rights of women, and we recommend the following. 1, ratify international human rights instruments that Cuba has not yet ratified, and in particular the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This will strengthen the protection of human rights. And 2, take all measures necessary to prevent violence against women, persons with disabilities, and this includes dissemination efforts. We also express our concern over the situation of human rights defenders and journalists, and in particular those considered to be political opposition. Thank you. Thank you. I now give the floor to Jordan.
Madam Vice President, I have the pleasure to welcome the head and members of the delegation of Cuba, and we commend the efforts invested in the preparation of the current review report. This reflects accomplishments in the area of human rights since the submission of the previous report. This also includes the integration of human rights for the first time in the new constitution and adoption of national programs and penal codes to address racism and racial discrimination. In a constructive spirit, we would like to recommend the following. First, the establishment of a national human rights institution underpinned by the Paris Principles. Second, improve medical and social services in society and to pay heed to older persons. Second, to promote schooling and education programs in remote areas with a focus on elementary education. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Kazakhstan welcomes the delegation of Cuba to the 4th cycle of UPR and thanks it for its presentation. My delegation commends the adoption of several programs and strategies aimed at promoting protecting human rights. Such as the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination, National Program for the Advancement of Women, and a comprehensive strategy on prevention and support in relation to gender-based and family violence. We would like to make the following recommendations. 1, to strengthen the means to protect people in situations of vulnerability or at risk not being able to exercise their right to food. 2, keep up actions aimed at raising the quality and seriousness of the teaching-learning process. 3, encourage an even greater participation of civil society.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Kenya has the floor.
I thank you, Madam Vice President. Kenya warmly welcomes the distinguished high-level delegation of Cuba to this fourth cycle of UPR process. My delegation applauds Cuba for its adoption of new constitution in 2019, the creation of a national commission to combat racism, racial discrimination, and commend it for the robust women representation in public service and participation in decision-making processes, and urge it to continue raising awareness on gender-based and family violence. Kenya makes the following 2 recommendations for consideration. 1, increase efforts to provide the social protection programs to guarantee an adequate standard of living for persons living with disabilities. 2, finalize the review of the National Action Plan to prevent and combat trafficking in persons and protection of victims. Finally, Kenya wishes the delegation of Cuba a successful UPR process. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Kuwait.
Thank you, Vice President. My delegation has reviewed the report under review, and we thank the delegation of Cuba for the presentation of the report. We also commend the new constitution of Cuba that reiterates a firm commitment to respect and promotion of human rights, and we commend its keenness on cooperation with international human rights mechanisms. We would like to make the 2 following recommendations. 1, to maintain its firm position regarding intolerance, terrorism, and Islamophobia. 2nd, to adopt the updated National Action Plan to combat and prevent human trafficking and the protection of victims. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Kyrgyzstan, and they will be presenting by video message.
Thank you, Mr. President. Kyrgyzstan warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba, appreciates the engagement in the UPR process, and thanks for presentation of the national report. We recommend 1, strengthen the protection of women, their equal rights and responsibilities in all spheres, and ensure the enjoyment of their sexual and reproductive rights without any discrimination. 2, effectively implement the adopted policy on integrated care for children, adolescents, and youth. 3, based on an intersectoral approach, improve the quality of life of people with disabilities, guarantee their active participation in society and the maximum possible development of their independence. Thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Laupedia commends Cuba for its tireless efforts in improving legal and institutional framework to promote and protect human rights, including the adoption of the new constitution. My delegation would like to make 2 following recommendations. 1, continue to improve access to free public health services for all citizens. And 2, continue to work toward broadening the use of information and communication technologies to various sectors of economic and social life. We wish Cuba a success in this UPR review. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Lebanon.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Lebanon warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks them for their report. Lebanon commends Cuba for its relentless efforts to promote and protect human rights and the progress achieved in fulfilling the socio-economic rights of all its citizens. In a constructive spirit, we recommend Cuba to continue strengthening the national structures aimed at promoting cultural diversity. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Lesotho.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Lesotho welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba to the 4th UPR cycle. We welcome efforts made by Cuba to guarantee the right to equality and freedom from discrimination by incorporating Chapter 8 into the new criminal code, which addresses all forms of discrimination and differentiation that might impair human dignity. Notwithstanding the above positive development, Lesotho wishes to make the following 3 recommendations for consideration by Cuba. 1, to ratify ICCPR and ICED. 2, to ensure the full respect of the freedom of expression, association, and assembly by law enforcement agencies. And lastly, to redouble efforts to fight gender-based violence. We wish Cuba every success with this UPR cycle. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Libya.
Thank you, Vice President. My delegation welcomes the delegation of Cuba during this review, and we commend its cooperation with the UPR mechanism and the steps taken by the government aimed at promoting the participation of women in political life and improving access to leadership positions. In this context, we recommend the following. First, shore up efforts to promote the rights and protect the rights of the child, especially those related to education and health. Second, step up efforts to implement the national plan to combat and prevent human trafficking and for the protection and assistance to victims. We wish Cuba every success. I thank you, Madam Vice President. شكرا. الكلمة الآن لليشتنشتاين. رسالة مسجلة. شكرا السيدة نائبة الرئيس. نوصي بما يلي. أولا التصديق على نظام روما الأساسي لمحكمة الجنائية الدولية. ثانيا التصديق على البروتوكول الاختياري لاتفاقية مناهضة التعذيب. ثالثا اتخاذ خطوات من أجل إلغاء كامل لعقوبات الإعدام. رابعا حماية المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان والصحفيين من المضايقة والاعتداء والاحتجاج التعسفي. خامسا ضمان حرية التجمع السلمي وتكوين النقابات وذلك اتساقا مع معايير حقوق الإنسان. شكرا.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Lithuania welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for its national report. We know the positive developments since the last UPR cycle, especially regarding the rights of the child and persons with disabilities. However, shrinking space for civil society, religious groups, human rights defenders, journalists, and other media workers remain of concern. The written decision to extend the list of crimes for which capital punishment can be applied is especially alarming. Lithuania would like to recommend 1. To reduce the number of offenses punishable by death penalty as the first step towards its abolition. 2. Guarantee the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, as well as freedom of opinion and expression. Free all political prisoners, including minors, and prevent human trafficking in line with Cuba's international obligations. 3. Consider developing policies to ensure unhindered public access to diverse independent sources of information, both online and offline, also connection to the Internet. Lithuania wishes Cuba all success in this UPR. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Luxembourg. Thank you, Vice President. Luxembourg welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for presenting its national report and for the efforts it has made to implement the 3rd cycle recommendations. My delegation would like to make the following recommendations. 1, that it set up a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 2nd, that it develop a general law on the rights of the child and revise laws so that they comply with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And 3rd, prevent and put an end to arbitrary detentions, acts of harassment and intimidation, threats and attacks on reputation directed against human rights defenders, journalists, and artists. We wish all success to the delegation of Cuba in implementing the recommendations of this UPR. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la.
Thank you. I give the floor to Madagascar. Thank you, Vice President. Madagascar welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for its report. My delegation would like to single out the efforts made by the Cuban government to integrate and include the category of human rights in its 2019 constitution, and the fact that the right to education, allowing for free access to comprehensive secondary primary school education, and which is translated into reality by a literacy rate of 99.8% has happened. We note with satisfaction legislative reforms, we would like to make the following recommendations: that it ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that it work on the basis of progress already made by establishing an international national human rights institution. Thank you. We wish you all success. Thank you. I give the floor now to Malawi.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Malawi warmly welcomes Cuba to this review and thanks the esteemed delegation for the comprehensive presentation. Malawi takes note of the country's commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights as evidenced by the adoption of the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination in 2019 and the National Program of Advancement of Women in 2021. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, Malawi makes the following recommendations to Cuba. 1, continue implementing laws and policies for the total elimination of racial discrimination. Secondly, develop a gender strategy in the legal system to promote a cross-cutting approach to the elimination of stereotype in the drafting and interpretation of legal regulations, and improve social protection and welfare programs for the benefit of vulnerable groups such as persons with disability and their families. We wish Cuba all the best. Thank you, Madam.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Malaysia thanks Cuba for the presentation of its national report and would like to recommend the following. Take proactive steps to raise awareness about the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and its protocols among the stakeholders. Continue taking the necessary measures to facilitate the participation of elderly and persons with disabilities in electoral and decision-making processes, and step up the protection measures for workers' rights by fulfilling its obligation under the ILO Convention. We wish Cuba a successful review.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Maldives.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Maldives warmly welcomes and thanks the distinguished delegation of Cuba for the presentation of its 4th UPR cycle. The Maldives recognizes that despite the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, Cuba has made good progress in implementing the recommendation of the previous UPR cycle. We note the significant progress made by Cuba to promote and protect the rights of women and children. In this regard, we welcome the adoption of the National Program for Advancement on Women, which serves as a crucial framework for developing policies that advance women's rights and gender equality. In constructive spirit, the Maldives makes the following 2 recommendations: enhance accessibility to healthcare services to all persons with disabilities, continue training initiatives for professionals and workers involved in preventing and combating human trafficking. Finally, we wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Mali.
Mali.
Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to the Marshall Islands by video.
Comes the delegation of Cuba. We commend Cuba on its efforts to ensure disaster preparedness by continuing to strengthen its early warning systems and the high priority given to the protection of its people from disasters. We further commend Cuba for its recognition of new human rights through its 2019 Constitution, including the right to water, the right to healthy and adequate food, the right to a safe and healthy habitat, and to a healthy and balanced environment, among others. In a spirit of constructive dialogue, we recommend the following. 1. Ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and 2. Ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We wish the delegation every success during its 4th UPR cycle. Komotara, and I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Mauritius.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Mauritius delegation extends a very warm welcome to the high-level delegation of Cuba attending this 4th cycle of the UPR. Mauritius appreciates the efforts being made by Cuba to advance women's rights and equalities and welcomes Cuba's national program for the advancement of women 2021. We congratulate Cuba for the formalization of the family code, which inter alia abolished child marriage. In a brotherly spirit, we would like to recommend that Cuba, 1, continue providing the necessary care to women and girls who are victims of human trafficking, and 2, expand internet access in educational centers as a tool for teachers and students. We wish Cuba a successful review and continued progress. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Mexico. Thank you, Vice President. We thank Cuba for its report. We welcome the recent legislative progress made, such as the new 2019 Constitution and the National Program for the Advancement of Women of 2021. In a constructive spirit, Mexico respectfully recommends that it establish an independent human rights national institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. Second, that it establish an independent national mechanism to protect human rights defenders and journalists. And third, that it criminalize femicide as an offense and take the requisite measures to implement the constitutional and legal provisions needed to prevent all forms of violence against women and to protect victims. We wish success to Cuba in this cycle. Thank you very much. Thank you. I give the floor to Mongolia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Mongolia congratulates Cuba on the adoption of its new constitution in 2019, welcomes the subsequent legislative reforms, and encourages their further strengthening. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, Mongolia would like to make the following recommendations to Cuba. 1. To ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. 2. To establish its national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. 3. To take actions to continue improving rural women's access to health care services. We wish the delegation of Cuba every success in its review. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias. Thank you. I give the floor to Montenegro.
Montenegro.
Montenegro. I give the floor to Morocco. Thank you, Vice President. My delegation would like to thank Cuba for the presentation of its national report. We would like to salute the efforts made by the Cuban state to respect its international commitments relating to human rights, in particular by strengthening the legal and institutional framework. My delegation also welcomes the adoption of a new constitution of the Republic in 2019, which enshrines new rights. Aware of all the efforts already made by the Cuban government, Morocco would like to make 2 recommendations. First, that it ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and second, that it harmonize national legislation with the Constitution by adopting constitutional development laws to ensure the protection of the rights enshrined in the new Constitution. Morocco wishes Cuba every success in its UPR process. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Mozambique welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba and congratulates them for their national report. We commend the government of Cuba for the progress made in implementation of supported recommendations which arose from the last cycle of the UPR. In a spirit of constructive engagement, Mozambique recommends the following to Cuba. 1. Continue conducting human rights educational program in prison, which include prisoners' access to culture and sport. 2. To expand internet access in educational centers as a tool for teachers and students. Mozambique wishes Cuba a successful review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias. Thank you. I give the floor to Namibia by video.
I warmly welcomes the esteemed delegation of Cuba. We congratulate them for the comprehensive presentation of their national report outlining the numerous positive human rights impact measures taken during the period under review. While applauding these measures, we reiterate our call for the lifting of the 61-year-old illegal economic, commercial, and financial blockade imposed on the Cuban government and its people. Namibia recommends the following for consideration by Cuba. 1. Establish an independent national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. And 2. Continue with the efforts to implement the Family Code and operationalize the Family Ombudsman's Office established in 2023. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias. Thank you. I give the floor to Nepal.
Madam Vice President, Nepal welcomes the delegation of Republic of Cuba to the 4th cycle of UPR. We congratulate Cuba on the promulgation of new constitution in 2019. The adoption of national program against racism and racial discrimination is commendable. We take positive note of the creation of National Commission to follow up and monitor the implementation of Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In the spirit of cooperation, we recommend the followings. 1. Continue efforts towards strengthening Ombudsman Office in line with the Paris Principles. 2. Repeal the legal provisions that prohibit persons with intellectual and psychological disabilities from marrying and founding a family. We wish Cuba a successful review. I thank you, Madam.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Madam Vice President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks Cuba for the presentation of its national report. Building on EU27 declarations responding to the 11th of July 2021 and its aftermath, we welcome steps by the Cuban government to engage in dialogue with its citizens about their legitimate grievances. We recommend Cuba to 1. Cease harassment, repression, arbitrary arrests and detention of civil society, including human rights defenders, and safeguard all civil and political rights, including freedom of movement as guaranteed by the Cuban Constitution. 2. Ensure that all independent journalists and members of civil society can exercise their rights to freedom of expression, assembly and association, both online and offline, without fear of persecution or censorship. In conclusion, we commend Cuba for the provisions safeguarding human rights of LGBTQI+ persons in the new Family Code. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to New Zealand.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. New Zealand welcomes the delegation of Cuba. We commend the legislative changes made to Cuba's Family Code, including the legalization of same-sex marriage. New Zealand recommends that Cuba 1. Take measures to ensure that all people can exercise their rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. 2. Immediately and unconditionally release all prisoners of conscience who have been imprisoned for the peaceful exercise of their rights to freedom of expression, association or peaceful assembly. 3. Ratify the ICCPR and its second optional protocol. And 4. Continue efforts to remove internet access restrictions to guarantee the right to access information. We wish Cuba every success in its review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Nicaragua. The Government of Reconciliation and National Unity of the Republic of Nicaragua congratulates the Republic of Cuba on the victories and success achieved in protecting and promoting human rights for all people without discrimination of any kind. We would highlight the heroism of the government and the proud people of Cuba resisting hostility, aggression, and the criminal blockade imposed on Cuba by the U.S. Nicaragua would like to make the following recommendations in a spirit of respecting the self-determination and sovereignty of Cuba, that it continues denouncing the criminal blockade imposed by the United States on the country, that it encouraged Cuba to continue participating actively in United Nations human rights bodies, promoting or preferring dialogue and cooperation in accordance with non-selectivity, etc. We recommend that it continue consolidating a national health system, which is public, and it continue developing the national program for the advancement of women, and it also continue developing the policy for comprehensive care for children and adolescents. Thank you very much. Thank you, and I'll call on Niger by Zoom. Oh, I'm in the room. You have the floor. Vice President Niger, I would like to wish a warm welcome to the delegation of Cuba in this fourth UPR cycle. My delegation warmly congratulates Cuba on strengthening its legal framework, characterized by the adoption of 118 new laws of the level of superior legal norms between 2019 and December 2022, as well as its resilience of an outstanding nature in the face of the embargo that has been imposed on it for several decades. In its constructive spirit, we'd recommend that Cuba ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishments, and second, that it ratify the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families. Lastly, we wish all success to Cuba in this review. Thank you very much. Thank you. I give the floor to Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nigeria welcomes the delegation of the Republic of Cuba to the presentation of its national report and commends the government for commitment to its international human rights obligations. We take positive note of the efforts by the Cuban government towards adopting a national plan of action to prevent and combat trafficking in persons and protection of victims. We further applaud the government of Cuba for its efforts towards providing public, free of charge and accessible national healthcare systems. While acknowledging various efforts and commitments of the government of Cuba to promote and protect human rights, Nigeria wishes to recommend as follows. 1. To consider the ratification of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and 2. To take further necessary measures to ensure adequate protection of migrants and refugees. Finally, we wish Cuba a very successful review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Norway.
Vice President, Norway welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for the presentation of its report. Norway commends Cuba for making important progress in the judicial protection of women, children, and LGBTI+ persons in the new family code from 2022. However, we remain concerned about the human rights situation in general and civil and political rights in particular. Norway recommends that Cuba, 1. Ratify the ICCPR and the ICESCR without reservations. Create a safe and enabling environment for civil society, human rights defenders, and independent journalists. That was 2. 3. Refrain from using the new penal code to criminalize civil society actors and individual voices critical of the authorities. And 4. Ratify the second optional protocol of the ICCPR, aiming at the abolition of the death penalty. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Oman.
شكرا سعادة الرئيس. يسرني أن أرحب.
Thank you, Vice President. I welcome the head of the delegation of Cuba, which is a friendly country, and we welcome their efforts to prepare the report. We have acquainted ourselves with this national report, and we see that work has been done to implement the recommendations from the last UPR. I'm speaking in particular of the establishment of a national commission for reporting and follow-up concerning persons with disabilities, and the National Commission for the Empowerment of Women and the National Commission Against Racism and Racial Discrimination. In a framework of effective cooperation, we'd like to make the following recommendation: that it enshrine the right to free education for all as a priority, and that it take into account the need to deal with vulnerable people. And 3rd, the need to establish residences and day hospitals and geriatric hospitals. 4, that it pursue efforts to expand access to internet. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the delegation to respond to the comments and observations put forward so far. You have the floor, Excellency. Yes, thank you very much, Vice President. We thank the distinguished delegations for their statements, and we will now provide additional information on some of the subjects raised in their statements. Also, we will respond to some of the questions that we have received before the meeting. It is a pleasure to give the floor to 2 members of our delegation. First of all, Mr. Julius Martinez, President of the Commission on Administrative and Tribunal of the Administration of Cuba, and then Ms. Cayo Rivera, the advisor to the Ministry of Justice. You have the floor. Thank you, Minister. On behalf of the organizations of civil society that I represent, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to participate in the delegation of Cuba in this important exercise. First of all, I'd like to talk about the all overarching reforms which have been occurring in Cuba since 2018 and that strengthen the institutional framework for the recognition, promotion, and protection of human rights. A major step was at the enactment of the new Constitution of the Republic in 2019, which governs a major expansion of rights and freedoms, and it establishes a system of guarantees allowing for the protection and defense of human rights enshrined in the legal order, including those recognized in international legal instruments which are in force for our country. The Cuban legal system is of essence people-based. We have democratic, representative, and deliberative and direct processes in place through which civil society in Cuba participates actively in the decision-making process politically. Since the last review of Cuba, there have been 2 people's consultations, 2 national referendums, and several specialized consultations. The transformations that have been made in the structure of the state are the most relevant ones that have occurred in the last 6 decades. They have had impact on the functioning of state bodies approved, as is shown by the democratic transformation. We see as the prime body of the state the National Council, which is a body which is independent functionally to organize and supervise elections, popular consultations, plebiscites, and referendums in the country. In relation to some statements made in this exercise, we would reaffirm that in Cuba, elections are free, democratic, and transparent. The electoral system does not have any electoral barriers. The voting system is voluntary. Citizens have the right to elect to vote as of 16 years of age and to be elected as of 18, to occupy any representational post without any discrimination. In the country, the revocation and accountability are popular monitoring mechanisms on the behavior of their representatives. Ever since 2008, there have been 4 electoral processes with a high level of participation by the people. In the municipal elections of 2022, the 60.6% of the citizens registered in the electoral lists exercised their right to vote, and 4,000 odd municipal officers were elected. In the national elections to elect the parliamentarians in the national parliament, these took place in March 2023. In exercising their vote, there were 71.8% of the electors registered, and out of the 470 parliamentarians elected, 40% were black and mulatto. About 20% were between 18 and 25 years of age. The average age is 40, and out of them, about 40% are university graduates. These data reflect the majority support on the part of the Cuban people of the system established in the Constitution of the Republic. Some delegations referred to the suggestion, or rather the legal system. I would like to mention that in Cuba we have a social justice system where we recognize and respect the principles of constitutional supremacy and legality. Constitutionally, the rights to freedom of expression, of assembly, of demonstration and association are recognized if they are done with legal purposes and peacefully. And there is also a right to participate in the forming and exercise of state control. Also, there's an enshrinement of the principles of transparency, responsibility, and separation and differentiation of state functions and powers. Cuban laws regulate punishments and penalties to be applied to violations of constitutional rights if there is non-observance, particularly by legal representatives or law enforcement agents. Now, concerning religious freedom in Cuba, distinguished delegates, I would like to make it clear that the Constitution enshrines the secular nature of the state and prohibits discrimination on the basis of religious beliefs. In the country, all people have the right to profess their rejection of religious beliefs, and all this has to be done in conformity with the law. There are about 1,800 religious organizations and brotherhoods with a membership of about 1,500,000 people. Many people are members of different structures of decision-making politically in the country, including the National Assembly of People's Power, the supreme body of state power. Thank you.
Distinguidos delegados.
Distinguished delegates, I will start by highlighting the fact that in the legislative schedule for the National Assembly for People's Power for the period 2023 to 2027, we plan to approve 52 laws and 29 decrees. In a year of implementing the Family Code, it has proved to be useful. We have formalized 1,000 marriages of a same-sex nature, and 600 were between men and the rest were women. Moreover, 840 unions of a common law nature were also carried out, and 282 marriage pacts were entered into, and there also were agreements on parental responsibility and notarial custody processes, listening to the views of children. There has also been consent granted to assisted reproductive processes. We would like to highlight the establishment of the Ombudsman's Office in May 2023. In 4 months, 18 cases have been dealt with relating to housing, labor, and social security inter alia. The Constitution and the laws protect victims from all manifestations of gender violence. Ever since 2021, Cuba has a comprehensive strategy for the prevention of and care for gender-based violence and dealing with family problems, and also the authorities are obliged to investigate such behavior. The protocols include periodic training for public officials responsible for this area. In June 2023, we launched the Observation Center on Gender Equality for the compilation and dissemination of data on this subject. The statistics of the observatory reflect the fact that in the cases registered in 2022, 18 women were victims of murders based on gender, and this is 39 out of every 100,000 women. And those perpetrators were imposed with life sentences and given life sentences or lengthy imprisonment sentences. And there are other cases that are before the competent courts in accordance with the laws. It's timely to point out that because of its broad membership, its representativeness and legitimacy and ability to mobilize itself, the organizations for civil society and human rights defenders in Cuba participate actively in the designing and implementation of national policies and public policies. In our country, we have recorded 2,251 associations in accordance with the existing laws. Moreover, there is a broad spectrum of social movements, community networks, and projects of a wide variety of forms, which show the wide richness of the Cuban society. Right now, we're working on a new law on associative forms that is provided for in the legislative calendar. In December 2021, we approved the law on the protection of personal data, which restricts access and the use of these data without the authorization of the owner, and the observation to inform the owner of this use. And there's also therefore a constitutional protection of people's rights in the face of the need to have some information about the population. I would also highlight that the system of digital transformation in Cuban society has enabled us to ensure that more than 7 million users have access to internet services, and these reach 44.6% of educational institutions in our country. We are continuing to make progress in increasing these figures. Distinguished delegates, Cuba is maintaining a policy of zero tolerance concerning human trafficking in any form, and is bolstering its work to combat this scourge and related offenses. The incidence of such incidents in our country is quite low. In the period from 2019 to 2022, 46 cases were brought to the courts. Lastly, I would like to convey the fact that we have updated the national plan for the prevention and dealing with human trafficking and giving care to the victims as a fundamental tool in coordinated action between the state and civil society organizations in Cuba. Thank you very much.
Agradezco la delegación.
I would like to thank the delegation for their clarifications, and now we will continue with our list of speakers, beginning with China.
谢谢副主席女士。
Thank you, Madam President. The Chinese delegation commends Cuba's efforts and achievements in the promotion and protection of human rights. Cuba has enacted a new constitution, enhanced its legal framework for the promotion and protection of human rights, made positive progress in the fields of education and healthcare, and effectively protected vulnerable groups. Cuba has effectively responded to COVID-19, representing its contribution to international public health. We have 3 recommendations. 1, to continue implementing measures to overcome the difficulties posed by UCMs, while working towards ensuring its citizens' ESC rights and improving their living standards. 2, to continue international cooperation in healthcare and actively share its experience in preventing and treating infectious disease with other countries. 3, continue promoting gender equality, eradicating gender-based discrimination, and protecting the rights and interests of women. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. Panama has the floor. Madam Vice President, Panama greets the delegation of Cuba and would like to recommend to implement the CIPD-25 commitment in order to identify efforts necessary for the effective and speedy implementation of the CARO Plan of Action and working it with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, to create a coordination mechanisms for the affairs of children, and to continue implementing the Family Code, and to set up the Family Ombudsman's Office, to define feminicide as a crime, and to pass a law against gender violence, and to carry out awareness-raising campaigns on violence against women and girls, including domestic violence. We wish Cuba a successful UPR review. Thank you. Thank you. Paraguay is recognized. Thank you, Vice President. We greet Cuba and we appreciate the reports. We welcome the new Constitution and its content, which is in line with the previous recommendation. However, the lack of specific legislation on gender-based violence and the ongoing existence of the death sentence in criminal law are matters of concern. With all due respect, we recommend 1, to ratify international agreements on civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights in line with the recommendation of the previous review. 2, to have an open, ongoing invitation for mandate holder visits and those of special procedures. 3, to definitively abolish the death penalty. 4, to improve the regulatory framework on gender-based violence, including a law against all forms of gender-based violence. And 5, to strengthen the national mechanism for implementation and follow-up to human rights recommendations, considering the possibility of receiving cooperation to that end. Thank you. Thank you. Peru has the floor. Thank you, Madam Vice President. Peru would like to cordially welcome the delegation of Cuba and thank them for the presentation of their national reports. With a constructive spirit, Peru would like to recommend 1, to consider the ratification of the international human rights agreements. 2, to step up efforts in order to guarantee that human rights defenders can work in a safe and fitting environment, as well as to ensure that all acts of harassment, repression, or intimidation are duly investigated. 3, to bolster measures to combat gender-based violence and existing sexist stereotypes. 4, to consider reforms in order to expressly prohibit discrimination on the grounds of political opinion or social origin in the area of employment. We hope that this new UPR cycle will contribute to the improvement of the enjoyment of human rights in Cuba. Thank you. Thank you. Philippines has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Philippines welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba. The Philippines positively notes the adoption of the new Constitution in 2019 that strengthened and expanded the legal framework for the protection and promotion of human rights. We also commend Cuba's long-standing progressive policies in such areas as public health, education, gender equality, and children's rights. To build on the progress achieved, The Philippines, in the spirit of friendship and constructive dialogue, offers the following recommendations. 1, to continue to undertake legislative reforms to harmonize laws with expanded rights and guarantees embodied in the new Constitution, and 2, sustain juvenile justice system reforms to ensure the humane treatment of children in conflict with the law in accordance with the principle of the best interest of the child. The Philippines wishes Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Poland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Poland thanks Cuba for presentation of the national report. We acknowledge that the new constitution adopted in 2019 strengthened the institutional human rights framework in different areas. Poland would like to recommend Cuba to 1. Ratify ICCPR and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and bring national legislation into compliance with these covenants. 2. Guarantee anyone's right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and the freedom of movement, including the civil society representatives, journalists and human rights defenders. 3. Make sure that child justice system is fully in line with the Convention on the Right of the Child and other relevant standards. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Portugal has the floor.
Gracias, Vice-Presidente. Portugal welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for the presentation of its national report. We commend Cuba for devising strategies and programs related to the rights of women and persons with disabilities, as well as to combat racism and gender-based violence. Portugal recommends that Cuba, 1, ratifies the international covenants on political and civil rights and on economic, social and cultural rights. 2, abolishes the death penalty. And 3, establishes an independent national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principles. Portugal wishes Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Qatar has the floor. Thank you, Vice President. We would like to welcome the delegation of Cuba and thank it for the presentation of its national report and for having implemented recommendations of the previous UPR. The national report mentions the legislative and institutional measures that have been adopted by Cuba in order to strengthen the human rights institutional framework and to protect human rights. We would like to make the following recommendations to Cuba. To further highlight Cuba's work and experience in international cooperation for the promotion of health, in particular through the training of personnel. We also recommend to strengthen the network of national institutions to provide special care for older persons and to continue to strengthen the early warning systems for natural disasters. Thank you. Thank you. Romania is recognized.
Vice President, Romania welcomes Cuba's delegation and wishes it a successful outcome of the UPR. We take note of the positive steps represented by the adoption of the new constitution by Cuba in 2019. We would like to constructively recommend Cuba to 1. Comply with the schedule to fully harmonize its legislation with the Constitution. 2. Ratify the international human rights instruments to which Cuba is not a party yet, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. 3. Ensure that civil society members, human rights defenders and journalists can operate freely and safely, including by repealing the restrictions within the new penal code. Thank you, Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you. The Russian Federation has the floor.
President, we thank the delegation of Cuba and we welcome the delegation and congratulate them on their report. Given the efforts made by Cuba to implement the recommendations adopted during the last cycle, we would like to say that they are now working successfully to implement most of the major human rights instruments. The Russian Federation recommends that Cuba implement the national plan to combat the use of narcotic substances and to carry out psychological consultations and to combat human trafficking. We would recommend that there be a dialogue with other countries on the basis of mutual respect, sovereignty, and the right to take decisions on the basis of their political system. We would support the efforts made by the Cuban society to participate in international fora on human rights, and there should not be a politicized and selective approach to human rights issues in those fora. Thank you very much.
Tiene la palabra Samoa.
Samoa is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Samoa warmly welcomes the Honorable Minister Bruno Rodriguez and delegation. Despite the embargoes and challenges stemming from climate change, we commend the Republic of Cuba on their resilience and progress, especially in the development of the COVID-19 vaccine, universal education, and the adoption of their new constitution in 2019. We further commend Cuba on their active engagement as an HRC member. Samoa's recommendations are as follows. 1. With the support of HCHR, establish a national mechanism for reporting and follow-up, and consider establishing a human rights recommendation tracking database to support its work. 2. Strengthen international cooperation in regard to the improvement and expansion of early warning systems and increasing capacity building in the field of disaster risk reduction, both at the national and community level. 3. Continue to enhance human rights education by raising awareness on...
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Saudi Arabia has the floor.
شكرا سيدنا نائب الرئيس. أود أن
Thank you, Vice President. I would like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Perea, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the accompanying delegation. We thank them for that report and present the following recommendations. First, to consider the implementation of a national mechanism on children's rights to ensure the effective implementation of the new criminal code and the criminal procedural code, to continue its efforts to encourage the participation of all citizens in the implementation of a cultural policy, to continue its efforts to enhance youth participation in decision-making processes, and to continue efforts made so far to protect human rights. We wish Cuba every success in this cycle. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Thank you, Vice President. Senegal wishes to extend a cordial welcome to the delegation of Cuba and thank them for the presentation of their report. My delegation welcomes the significant progress made by the government of Cuba since the previous cycle, namely strengthening the legal and institutional framework for the protection of human rights, mainly of certain social groups such as women, children, persons with disabilities, and older persons, as well as the actions taken to combat human trafficking. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, my delegation would like to present the following recommendations. To consider acceding to the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Family. 2. To further efforts aimed at strengthening the promotion of the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights of Cubans of African descent. Senegal wishes every success to Cuba in this review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Serbia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Republic of Serbia welcomes the delegation of Cuba at the UPR session and thanks it for presenting its national report. Serbia commends the efforts Cuba has invested in responding to recommendations from the previous UPR cycle, as well as its improvement in cooperation with the United Nations human rights mechanisms. We welcome the comprehensive legislation reform that has taken place in Cuba, including the promulgation of the new constitution, strengthening the legal and institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights. We also welcome the adoption of the National Program for the Advancement of Women, as well as the comprehensive strategy on prevention and support in relation to gender-based and family violence, reflecting Cuba's commitment to women's rights and gender equality. We recommend Cuba to continue its efforts towards strengthening the legal framework to ensure women's rights and gender equality. We encourage Cuba to consider the establishment of a national human rights institution to further support the progress achieved in the promotion and protection of human rights. Serbia wishes Cuba a successful and fruitful review process.
Gracias. Tiene la...
Thank you. Sierra Leone has the floor.
Paila and the Cuban delegation. We welcome the establishment of the National Program Against Racism and note in particular the establishment of a national commission mandated to monitor measures to combat and eradicate racism, discrimination, and other forms of intolerance. In support of the government's initiative to address systemic racism, we offer the following recommendations. 1. Invest in research into racial inequalities in different areas, such as health, education, and employment. 2. Demonstrate political will to address racism at the highest levels of government and advocate for inclusive policies and practices that prioritize racial equality. 3. Create platforms for individuals to share their experiences and perspectives and maintain an ongoing dialogue on racial issues with society to address emerging challenges. Salon wishes Cuba a successful review, and I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Singapore has the floor.
Madam Vice President, Singapore welcomes the participation of Cuba in the UPR process and commends Cuba on its progress since its third review. Cuba has made commendable strides in protecting women and children's rights, especially in tackling gender-based and family violence. Women's participation in decision-making in many aspects of a society has also expanded. We welcome the adoption of a national program for the advancement of women in 2021 and recommend that Cuba continue its effort in promoting and protecting women's rights. Cuba has demonstrated strong commitment to zero tolerance of drug trafficking and abuse and implemented its national program for prevention and control of addiction with special emphasis on children and young people. Singapore recommends that Cuba cooperate with the UNODC and other international organizations to strengthen its capacity to combat drug trafficking and abuse-related issues. We hope that our recommendations will be favorably considered. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la...
Thank you. Slovakia has the floor.
Thank you, Vice President. Slovakia welcomes the delegation of Cuba to this UPR session. We commend Cuba for adoption of legislation which strengthens human rights in Cuba. We call on Cuban authorities to release imprisoned representatives of civil society and opposition parties and ensure them fair and due trial. Slovakia offers following recommendations to Cuba for further consideration. 1. Ratify ICCPR, ICE-SCR, OPCAT and the third optional protocol to the Convention on the Right of the Child on Communications Procedures. Second, ensure the necessary medical care for imprisoned political opponents. We wish Cuba a successful review. I thank you, Madam President, Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you. Slovenia has the floor via video.
Excellencies, Slovenia wishes to commend the delegation of Cuba for the national report, its presentation today, and the commitment to the UPR process. Slovenia would like to repeat our recommendation from the previous cycle to consider ratifying the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the optional protocol to the CEDAW Convention. Slovenia commends Cuba for the adoption of a new constitution in 2019. Slovenia remains concerned regarding cases of arbitrary arrests, imprisonment and reprisals against human rights defenders and journalists, especially those considered to be political opponents. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Somalia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Somalia warmly welcomes the high-level delegation of the Republic of Cuba to this session and applauds the positive engagement of the government with the UPR mechanism, as well as the progress achieved in the field of human rights since last review. In a spirit of constructive dialogue, Somalia recommends the following. Take actions to continue improving rural women's access to healthcare services, continue to support the work carried out by Cuban organizations for persons with disabilities, continue to develop Cuba's legal and institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights, continue providing solidarity aid to other countries affected by disasters, as well as sharing experiences and knowledge in this area. Somalia wishes Cuba every success in this review. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias.
Thank you. South Africa has the floor.
Vice President, South Africa welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba. South Africa commends Cuba for its new constitution together with the efforts to update the legislative framework. We welcome the new criminal code, which includes an offense of discrimination on grounds of skin color and the crime of apartheid. We acknowledge that despite the blockade, Cuba has succeeded in establishing a universal education and health system for all. South Africa wishes to make the following recommendations. Continue to improve the legal and institutional framework for the protection and promotion of human rights. Continue with efforts to monitor and combat any vestiges of racism, racial prejudice, and racial discrimination. And continue to bolster the implementation of the comprehensive strategy to prevent gender-based violence. South Africa wishes Cuba a successful review. Gracias.
Thank you. Spain is recognized. Thank you very much, Vice President. Spain would like to welcome the Cuban delegation and thank the Foreign Minister for the presentation of the report. Spain recognizes that the government of Cuba is committed to the implementation of the recommendations from the previous cycle. Also, Spain commends Cuba for passing the Family Code, as well as for the legislative progress made on gender equality and the fight against discrimination. Spain recommends 1. To ratify the Civil Political Covenant, the Economic, Social, and Cultural one, and the optional protocol of the Convention Against Torture. 2. To declare a formal moratorium on the death penalty as a prior step to its complete abolition. To strengthen the provisions of the Criminal Code that prevent peaceful assembly, freedom of expression. 4. To guarantee a cross-cutting and comprehensive approach in the implementation of the legislation against gender violence. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Sri Lanka is recognized.
Madam Vice President, Sri Lanka warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and appreciates the comprehensive presentation made. We commend the significant legislative reforms undertaken by Cuba, which have led to strengthening the legal and institutional framework to promote and protect human rights. In a constructive spirit, Sri Lanka recommends that Cuba, 1. Continue to take measures to combat and to share knowledge and experience acquired in the fight against human trafficking. 2. Continues to implement policies to guarantee access to quality medical services for the entire population. 3. Increase the link between universities and research centers and production in order to place education and science at the service of the country's development. 4. Develop training activities for teachers and education staff, including in the area of human rights. We wish Cuba success in its UPR engagement. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Palestine is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The State of Palestine warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba, and we commend the efforts made to promote and protect human rights despite the challenges they face, in particular the UCM and embargo imposed by the U.S. In a constructive spirit, we recommend the following. To continue the internationalist and solidarity work, particularly in the field of health and in situations of disasters and epidemics, and to promote the experience of the international contingent Henry Reeve. To develop laws that further strengthen the freedom of religion and belief. Continue its efforts in rejecting the arbitrary and unjustified inclusion of Cuba on the United States unilateral list of state sponsors of terrorism. Continue its efforts in all international fora to reject all forms of unilateral cohesive measures in developing countries. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Sudan is recognized.
شكرا سيدنا نائب الرئيس.
Thank you, Vice President. The delegation of Sudan welcomes the delegation of Cuba under the leadership of His Excellency Bruno Brilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and thank him for the comprehensive presentation of the national reports. We commend the progress made in the areas of legislative and institutional reform, which includes the country's new constitution and the national plan to combat racism and the program for women. We recommend that Cuba continue efforts to strengthen policies to achieve food security and guarantee the right to food, and to continue to strengthen the legal and institutional framework to combat racism. We wish Cuba every success, and thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Suecia.
Thank you. Sweden.
Mr. President, Sweden takes note of the positive steps taken, such as family legislation reform and increased internet access. Serious concerns remain, however, for instance regarding the detentions and unproportionately long prison sentences in connection with the protests on 11th July 2021, the rights of freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Sweden would like to make the following recommendations. 1. Ensure full compliance with the United Nations standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners and allow independent human rights monitors access to trials and to prisons and detention centers. 2. ratify the ICCPR and the ICESCR without restrictions. 3. Issue a standing invitation to the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, including all special rapporteurs. Sweden wishes Cuba a successful review. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Switzerland has the floor. Madam Vice President, Switzerland would like to welcome the delegation of Cuba and thank them for the presentation of the report. We welcome the adoption in 2022 of the Family Code with a view to improving the protection of vulnerable people. The Marriage for All legislation is a significant step forward. Switzerland would like to make the following recommendations. 1. To take all necessary measures to abolish the death penalty, particularly by setting a formal moratorium on the use of the death penalty. 2. To take measures to guarantee the protection of human rights defenders, of journalists, and artists so that they can carry out their work without hindrance. 3. To guarantee, with the participation of civil society, the protection of women and girls against violence. 4. To continue to support the development of the private and semi-private sector in agriculture by authorizing the creation of a technical support non-governmental service and recognizing them as new economic stakeholders. Thank you. Thank you. The Syrian Arab Republic has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. We warmly welcome the Cuban delegation headed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we commend the wide range of achievements presented in the report, which reflects Cuba's genuine will to advance human rights in accordance with its social and political model chosen by its people, despite the illegal, immoral blockade which is designed to deliberately violate human rights of the Cuban people and undermine their social economic development. This blockade also affects its implementation of projects in the fields of health, education, for the benefit of peoples of other countries in the application of principles. We recommend continuing updating the Cuban model of economic social development in spite of the effect of the blockade imposed by the United States, maintain the emancipatory and country hegemonic cultural climate, especially through the active participation of communities and their inhabitants in the cultural and artistic life of the nation. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Timor-Leste has the floor by video.
Timor-Leste commends the progress that Cuba has made on human rights since its last UPR. This progress encompasses significant developments such as the amendment of the Constitution, the adoption of the new Family Code, the comprehensive strategy for the prevention and response to gender-based violence in the family setting, and the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination. We also applaud Cuba for its dedicated efforts in providing universal access to education and health care, as well as ensuring social protection coverage for its population. Furthermore, my delegation welcomes the adoption of the National Program for the Advancement of Women and Increase of Women in Decision-Making positions. In a constructive spirit, my delegation recommends Cuba to continue strengthening efforts to guarantee equal opportunities and rights for women in the labor sector, and to consider establishing a national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris Principle. We extend our best wishes for a successful UPR review for Cuba. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Togo is recognized.
Merci. Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We would like to recognize the distinguished delegation of Cuba for their update on the human rights situation in their country. Togo takes note of the reforms made and the efforts deployed since 2018 by the government to address the issue of human rights in their country. Further, in a constructive spirit, we recommend that Cuba continue with its cooperation with different human rights mechanisms in order to, among other things, improve the lot of persons with disabilities, children, and migrants. To conclude, the Togolese delegation would like to wish Cuba success in the implementation of its recommendations. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Trinidad and Tobago thanks the government of Cuba for its detailed report and its robust engagement in this fourth cycle. As a fellow small island developing state, we take note of the progress made by Cuba since its last review, such as the adoption of a new constitution and the establishment of a national program for the advancement of women. In a constructive spirit, Trinidad and Tobago recommends that Cuba 1. Continue to strengthen its legal and institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights. And 2. Continue to pursue technical cooperation and capacity-building opportunities, including South-South cooperation in order to tackle SIDS-related vulnerabilities. We wish the delegation of Cuba a successful review. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Tunisia.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. My delegation welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba and thanks it for submitting its national report. We note the steps taken by Cuba in implementing 2019 and its strengthening of its legal framework by adopting 118 higher laws that expand the scope of human rights protection. We also welcome the measures it has taken to ensure gender equality, empower women, and promote health care and education. Within the framework of positive interaction, we recommend continue efforts to care for the elderly and protect their rights. Second, continue efforts to protect the rights of persons with disabilities and ensure their integration into society. In conclusion, we wish the distinguished delegation of Cuba every success. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Turkey.
Madam Vice President, Turkey welcomes the delegation of Cuba headed by Foreign Minister His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla and thanks them for their presentation. We commend the economic and social steps taken by Cuba. We welcome the adoption of the family code, strengthening gender equality and further protecting women from violence. We commend Cuba's efforts to combat poverty and enhance right to food, water, and housing. In a constructive spirit, we recommend Cuba to continue implementing the national program against racism and racial discrimination, continue making the necessary efforts to protect the rights of workers, including those in the private sector, continue updating national legislation in accordance with Cuba's international commitments under international human rights instruments. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Uganda by Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Uganda warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba, and we congratulate them on the presentation of their fourth UPR report. We take this opportunity to commend the government of Cuba for all the positive steps they have taken in implementing the recommendations of the previous review and their cooperation with the human rights mechanisms. In the spirit of constructive dialogue, Uganda would like to make two recommendations. One, combat racial discrimination and promote equality for all persons, especially those of the African descent. Two, continue to strengthen policies and legal frameworks to ensure the protection of women and children from domestic and gender-based violence. We wish our brothers and sisters of Cuba a very successful review. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Ucrania.
I give the floor to the Ukraine.
Ukraine thanks the delegation of Cuba for presenting their national report. We note the efforts made to improve human rights protection framework, including the adoption of a new family code and measures to fight racism and discrimination. However, we are concerned that the new penal code could risk establishing even more limitations on basic civil liberties. We encourage Cuba to address the underlying causes for people's widespread discontent and recommend to ratify the ICCPR, International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, to release all those detained, especially children, for exercising their rights to freedom of peaceful assembly, opinion and expression, to establish shelters for women and children affected by gender-based and sexual violence. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United Arab Emirates.
شكرا سيدة نائبة الرئيس.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Cuba and thank it for the presentation of the national report. We appreciate the valuable efforts made by Cuba to promote and protect human rights, including the establishment of a comprehensive educational and health system. In this regard, we welcome Cuba's allocation of 48.7% of its budget to health and education. My delegation makes the following recommendation. Firstly, strengthen training programs for health personnel in order to systematically improve health services. Secondly, strengthen efforts related to the elderly and their social well-being, with a particular focus on their integration into community activities. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra el Reino Unido.
Thank you. I give the floor to the UK.
Vice President,
I'd like to offer a very warm welcome to the Cuban delegation.
The severe penalties handed down to pro-democracy and human rights campaigners in Cuba. We welcome, however, the steps taken to legalize same-sex marriage. The growing participation of women in political and economic life is also positive, but we regret the lack of initiatives to address gender-based violence. So we recommend that Cuba, 1, ensures the right to a fair trial through adherence to the UN's basic principles on the independence of the judiciary, 2, amends the provisions of its penal code to prevent its use to restrict freedom of expression and assembly, and 3, establish femicide as a separate offence in that same penal code. Muchas gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. I now give the floor to the United Republic of Tanzania by Zoom.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The United Republic of Tanzania welcomes the delegation of Cuba to the review, and we thank them for the comprehensive national report. We acknowledge the measures taken to advance women's rights. In that regard, we welcome the adoption of the National Program for the Advancement of Women. We also note the positive progress made in digital transformation. In the spirit of constructive engagement, we recommend the following to the government of Cuba for consideration. 1, to continue to provide the necessary care to women and girls who are victims of human trafficking, and 2, to continue strengthening the early warning systems for natural, technological, and health hazards. The United Republic of Tanzania wishes the delegation of Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United States.
President, we recommend that Cuba, 1, cease the practice of arbitrarily detaining journalists, opposition members, human rights defenders, religious actors, and other persons seeking to exercise their human rights and fundamental freedoms. 2, release the approximately 1,000 persons unjustly or arbitrarily detained, including those reportedly imprisoned for exercising their right to peaceful assembly, investigating and reporting on government activities, or expressing dissent. Once released, they must be allowed to travel freely, both domestically and internationally. 3, adopt a legal framework that ensures judicial independence. 4, end its one-party system to allow genuinely free and fair elections involving multiple political parties that provide citizens with real choices regarding their government. 5, comply with the international labor standards and cease using coercive practices to manipulate and pressure workers into participating in the labor export program, including medical missions. We also wish to remind Cuba that this is not the place for political discourse or bilateral engagement. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Uruguay. Thank you, Madam Vice President. Uruguay welcomes the delegation of Cuba. We thank them for their national report. Constructively, we recommend 1, that they ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights with an eye on abolishing the death penalty. 2, to positively respond to requests for visits that are pending with mandate holders and special procedures of the Council, and consider the possibility of extending a permanent open standing invitation to the mandate holders. 3, to strengthen the ability of the services for protecting women and children facing violence, and increase the obligatory training in the area of judges. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Uzbekistan.
Uzbekistan warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks for the presentation of comprehensive national report. We commend the measures taken by the government of Cuba to promote and protect human rights since its last review, and note with appreciation the constructive cooperation of Cuba with the relevant UN treaty bodies and special procedures. My delegation makes the following recommendations: to ensure systematical improvement on social protection and welfare programs for the benefits of people with disabilities and their families, to continue to develop Cuba's legal and institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights, to continue promoting the role of civil society in the country in accordance with the national legislation. We wish the delegation of Cuba every success in its review. Thank you for your attention.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Vanuatu.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Vanuatu welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba and thanks them for the informative presentation made today. Vanuatu appreciates Cuba's commitment to the UN mechanism, especially its ratification of several core international human rights instruments. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Vanuatu offers Cuba the following recommendation. 1, consider issuing a standing invitation to all OHCHR special procedure mandate holders. Vanuatu wishes Cuba every success at the present review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Venezuela. We hail our brother, the foreign minister, and our sister nation of Cuba, and we'd like to recommend that Cuba maintain the concept of the Cuban state as lay and develop laws that continue to strengthen freedom of religion as backed by the Constitution, that they continue to apply the national and international plans of action against the blockade by the United States until its immediate and unconditional lifting. 3, the continued development of programs in the area of literacy, namely Yes I Can, and I can continue to contribute to the fight against illiteracy in all areas of the world, and to defend its democratic, popular, and representative character of social order. Thank you. I give the floor back to the delegation to respond. Minister, the floor is yours.
Gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Allow me to thank the delegations that have taken the floor. I will now speak on behalf of our speaking on behalf of our delegation. We'll now hear from Madam Maricela Sosa Rabed, the Vice President of the Supreme Court, and then the head and the director of the Cancer Department at our Public Health Ministry. The floor is yours. Thank you very much, Minister. I would like to begin by expressing that the reforms in our criminal justice system in Cuba have brought a deep modification of our procedural and substantive norms. This bears in mind our international commitments. The new criminal code adopted last year eliminated certain security measures regarding social danger. There is not in our country any country serving measures such as this. In Cuba, all individuals are presumed innocent until there is a firm conviction against them, and they also have access to legal counsel since the beginning of their criminal proceedings. Allow me now to refer to the issue of the death penalty. Numerous delegations have brought up this issue. This was eliminated as a possible sentence for 4 common crimes compared to the previous criminal code. For more than 20 years, Cuba has not implemented this punishment. There are no punishments, no prisoners awaiting this sentence. No women have been executed, and this cannot be used for those of less than 20 years of age or women that are pregnant. As a response to some of the comments made, I would like to clarify that in Cuba, the age of criminal responsibility and liability is 16, and it is only those less than 18 years of age. Those of less than 18 years only face criminal charges when they commit serious crimes. The law favors people between 16 and 18 years of age, and the implementation of other features that protect them. This includes due process and the Beijing rules and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. When a person between 16 and 18 goes before the courts, the law favors punishments that are alternatives to jail time. Laws also fully protect those of less than 18 years of age that are victims of crimes. Further, I should like to underscore the protection set forth in our laws for those who have been subject to discrimination or that find themselves vulnerable or suffer or have disabilities. In line with the recommendations received from numerous treaty bodies, our criminal code, we have incorporated explicitly the crimes of aggression, torture, human organ trafficking, trafficking in persons, forced disappearance, and others. In July of 2022, we saw the entry into force of the Law of Amparo, or Constitutional Protection for Constitutional Rights. So far, we have seen 86 such cases before tribunals and 29 appeals. Distinguished delegates, as related to the incidents of 11 July 2021, I would like to stress that in no way can they be considered peaceful protests. They included disturbance, disorder, vandalism, and violence. This put into danger our collective security and the lives of our citizens. Individuals were injured, harmed. There was damage and destruction deliberately imposed on property and state institutions. The trials of those individuals that committed these crimes came with strict adherence to due process and within the framework of our laws that are in force. 33.3% of the accused had their original sanction or conviction modified, reducing the time, or they were given convictions that were alternatives to jail time. Of the 29 accused between 16 and 17 years of age, 27 received punishments that did not involve jail time. Only in 2 cases was jail time ordered, and this was based on them having committed extremely violent acts. Some comments from some delegations indicate, or rather following up on comments from some delegations, we would like to note that in Cuba, the justice system is imparted by the tribunals independently and in line with the basic principles of judicial independence. The recognition of a legal matter is exclusively in the hands of the tribunals. Judicial resolutions can only be modified by an appeal or a other review set forth by law. The judges and magistrates answer only to the law. They have immunity and they cannot be removed from their functions so long as that there are no legal cases that call for their removal. I would like to report that the Cuban courts have resolved this year more than 85% of the matters before them, and 92.5% of the convictions are executed in the same year. Thank you very much.
Señoras y señores,
ladies and gentlemen, I would like to refer to matters addressed by some of the delegations regarding the Cuban healthcare system. Healthcare in Cuba is a constitutional right. It is free of charge, public, and of universal access. From 2018 to 2020, life expectancy upon birth was of 77.7 years. At the close of 2022, the infant mortality rate was of 7.5 for every 1,000 live births, and the survival of children through 5 years of age was of 99.1%. There is a proportion or a ratio of 8.5 doctors for every 1,000 inhabitants. This places us in the #1 slot in the world in this indicator. All of this has been possible despite the blockade imposed on Cuba by the government of the United States for more than 60 years. This policy has caused grave harm to the health care sector. It goes over $3 billion. In August 2021 and July 2020, the blockade caused losses in the healthcare system totaling more than $238 million. The blockade significantly affects the healthcare institutions. The blockade limits the equipment, medical inputs, and medications. This includes those used for urgent therapy necessary in treating cancer in cases that are potentially curable, and this is primarily the case for children. The blockade also makes difficult the acquisition of contraception for the to prevent sexually transmitted diseases. The lack of resources for surgeries compels us, with anguish and pain, to extend the waiting time for our patients before they can be operated upon. This increases the risk of complications or death. I would like to emphasize the Cuban response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Cuba developed 5 vaccine candidates. Cuba produced the first vaccine against the virus in Latin America and the Caribbean. Through October of 2023, our country had administered 46 million doses of the Cuban vaccine. More than 10 million people have completed their vaccination regime, and that's for 91% of our population. The Cuban vaccinations, Abdala and Soberana 02, are among the most effective in the world. They have an efficacy rate of 92.2% and 91% respectively. Also, during the pandemic, there was a vaccination program for children that remained in place. It protects against 13 transmittable diseases. 10 of these vaccinations are produced domestically. This is one of the immunization programs with the greatest population coverage in the world. The United States has endeavored to block Cuban medical cooperation with countries in need. More than 605,000 Cuban medical cooperators have worked over 60 years in medical cooperation efforts from Cuba with the world in a voluntary manner. Again, voluntary and humanist manner. We have addressed the health and life of 165 nations and populations of different areas around the world. At the close of September 2023, our doctors have saved, over the last 6 decades, more than 10 million lives. We have provided surgery for more than 16 million people, and we have undertaken more than 5 million births or deliveries, that is, assisted in more than 5 million deliveries around the world. Currently, Cuba provides medical cooperation to 55 nations. We provide our services through more than 13,000 of our cooperators. Through September 2023, as a result of the miracle operation, Operación Milagro, by Cuba and Venezuela, we have undertaken more than 3 million free ophthalmological surgeries. This program has been extended to 27 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. Between 2020 and 2022, more than 5,000 Cuban doctors, of which 60% are women, helped to tackle COVID-19 in 42 countries and territories. This was organized into 58 medical brigades of the Henry Reeve Brigade, or contingent, specialized in disasters and serious epidemics. Further, in Cuba, more than 42,000 healthcare professionals have graduated from 149 countries, fundamentally in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Many of them have studied in Cuba free of cost with scholarships. We have also contributed to the training of professionals and technicians in the medical sciences in the countries where our Cuban medical brigades are operating. We recognize the many shows of gratitude, or we appreciate the many expressions of gratitude that we have received from many countries as a result of this cooperation. We reiterate that we do so and will continue to do so voluntarily. And we do so consistent with the deeply humanitarian nature of the Cuban Revolution, one that is marked by solidarity. Thank you very much. I thank the delegation for those statements. We will now continue with the list of speakers. I give the floor to Vietnam.
Vietnam.
Madam Vice President, Vietnam warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and appreciates their national UPR report. We commend Cuba's efforts and achievements in safeguarding and advancing human rights, including the following of legal reforms after the promulgation of the new Constitution of the Republic of Cuba in 2019. In a spirit of constructive dialogue, Vietnam makes two recommendations to Cuba to: 1. Continue to include the best interests of the child in all national policies and laws, especially in the context of the ongoing digital revolution. 2. Further promote effective measures in implementing commitments in relation to the international human rights mechanism. We wish Cuba a successful UPR cycle. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Yemen.
I call on Yemen by video. We can't hear the speaker.
Vamos a arreglar el problema técnico.
We'll try to solve that technical hitch. I'll go on to the next speaker. Zambia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We welcome the esteemed delegation of Cuba to the fourth cycle of the UPR and congratulate them for the presentation of their national report. We commend Cuba for the new constitution and efforts to improve its judicial system. We recommend as follows: 1. Consider the ratification of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2. Expedite the adoption of the special measures to eliminate discrimination affecting the African descent population. And 3, consider harmonizing domestic legislation with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and strengthening the monitoring mechanisms for its implementation. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Zimbabwe.
Vice President, Zimbabwe warmly welcomes the delegation of the Fraternal Republic of Cuba to its UPR process. And in the spirit of positive engagement, we recommend the following 5 actions. 1. Consider the implementation of measures to increase the purchasing power of Cuban workers' wages. 2. Continue to implement policies aimed at achieving greater representation of Afro-Cubans and people of mixed race in all areas of political and public life, as well as in decision-making positions. 3. Continue to denounce racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances in international fora. 4. Intensify the dissemination of the law of the protection of constitutional rights and the mechanisms to protect these rights. 5thly, increase special procedures visits to the country. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Algeria. Thank you, Vice President. My delegation, the delegation of Algeria, is very happy to welcome warmly the distinguished delegation of Cuba, headed up by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and thanks it for the presentation of its report. Algeria also welcomes the broad legislative reforms undertaken by Cuba to strengthen the legal and institutional framework for protecting and promoting human rights. In a constructive spirit, my delegation would recommend the following: that the country pursue its efforts aimed at promoting the enjoyment of all human rights in accordance with the national constitution and Cuban legislation, and second, that it maintain ongoing work of Cuban international solidarity, particularly in the area of health during disasters and epidemics, and to disseminate experience acquired by the international contingent in this respect. We wish all success to the delegation of Cuba in its UPR cycle. Thank you. I now call on Angola.
Gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Thank you, Vice President.
Maria and the delegation of Cuba and values their constructive cooperation with UN human rights bodies. We commend national authorities for sparing no efforts in improving the human rights situation despite the economic and social challenges due to unilateral coercive measures imposed to the country. Angola also commends Cuba for the adoption of national program to fight against racism and racial discrimination, as well as the new criminal code. Angola recommends Cuba the following: continue extending social protection coverage to vulnerable populations, to improve prison conditions for all inmates. Deseamos sucesos a Cuba en este EPO. Muchas gracias, señora vice.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Thank you. I give the floor to Antigua and Barbuda by video.
Thank you, Mr. President. Antigua and Barbuda warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of the Republic of Cuba for the fourth cycle of UPR and extends our gratitude for the presentation of the national report. We commend Cuba for its diligent efforts in promoting human rights at the national level, especially with regards to the Convention Against Torture and the Criminal Procedure Act of 2021, which focuses on strengthening due process guarantees. In the spirit of a constructive engagement, Antigua and Barbuda would like to propose the following recommendations to Cuba. First, to enhance efforts to prosecute traffickers and establish the necessary legal framework and procedures to protect the victims of traffickings and witnesses. By prioritizing the prosecution of traffickers, Cuba can ensure that justice is served and that vulnerable individuals are provided with a...
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Argentina. Thank you, Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Cuba and commend the approval of the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination, as well as the inclusion in the new constitution of the prohibition of any discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, as well as promotion of gender equality. Argentina recommends, first, that the country criminalize torture in accordance with the provisions of the Convention Against Torture. Second, that it consider the possibility of declaring a formal moratorium on the death penalty with a view to its future abolition. 3, that it continue developing measures to guarantee internally the implementation of the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. 4, and that it step up efforts to ensure that the comprehensive sex education program in schools promotes respect for diversity. Thank you. I now call on Armenia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Armenia welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks for the presentation of the comprehensive national report. We note with satisfaction that over the past few years, Cuba has been making progress in the overall situation with human rights in the country. At the same time, while noting that de facto moratorium on the death penalty exists since 2003, we recommend that Cuba considers declaring a formal moratorium on death penalty with a view to its abolition. Also, we recommend that Cuba puts an end to arbitrary restrictions and criminalization of the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and takes further measures to prevent the use of excessive force by law enforcement officials policing assemblies. In conclusion, we wish Cuba success in the 4th UPR cycle. Thank you, Madam.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Australia welcomes Cuba's progress on the protection of LGBTQI+ rights within its family code. Australia is concerned by the human rights situation in Cuba, which has deteriorated following the Cuban government's heavy-handed response to peaceful protests in 2021. Cuba's new penal code has placed further restrictions on freedom of expression and association. Australia recommends Cuba first continue its moratorium on the death penalty and take positive steps towards formal abolition. Second, pass a comprehensive law against gender-based violence. And third, take steps to promote the human rights of women and girls. None of us can ever do enough. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Iran by video. No, this is Azerbaijan. Iran.
Islamic Republic of Iran welcomes the high-level delegation of Republic of Cuba to this UPR session. We commend Cuba's prominent role in multilateralism and its consistent and resolute commitment to upholding human rights and engaging with human rights mechanisms. In the spirit of constructive engagement, Iran recommends Cuba to continue the country's consistent policy in sharing Cuba's achievements in the field of science and technology with developing countries, to maintain the call in international forums for the end of the unilateral coercive measures against developing countries, to continue taking effective measures for economic and social development in accordance with national development plans and priorities. Iran wishes Cuba a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Yemen.
Shukran, Sayyida Naibat al-Rais.
Thank you, Vice President. We welcome His Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, as well as the entire delegation. We very much value the detailed and very interesting presentation that was given that shed light on the successes achieved by the government of Cuba in the area of human rights. We appreciate the role and the valuable efforts made by Cuba as an active member in the Human Rights Council. We see Cuba's input in many of the resolutions that have already been adopted by the Council. My delegation applauds the work done on the area of human rights, and we'd recommend that Cuba continue with its programs of systematic training for public officials as well as law enforcement agents to meet better the challenges of racism and to ensure a better struggle. We wish all success to Cuba. Thank you. I now call on the Bahamas.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Bahamas thanks Cuba for presenting the national report and commends wide-ranging positive developments in the field of human rights since the last review, including a robust new constitution, enhanced cooperation with the UN human rights machinery, and a strengthened legal, institutional, and policy framework for promoting gender equality and women's empowerment. As a fellow Caribbean small island developing state, the Bahamas also appreciates that these developments take place in spite of challenges faced, including the impact of climate change. In a constructive spirit, the Bahamas recommends that Cuba, 1, fully implement the National Plan of Action to prevent and combat trafficking in persons and protect victims, and 2, continue efforts to eliminate gender stereotypes in Cuban society, including through awareness-raising campaigns. We wish Cuba a successful review process. I thank you.
Gracias. Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Bahrain.
Thank you. The Kingdom of Bahrain welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks them for their presentation. We acknowledge Cuba's progress on human rights since its last Universal Periodic Review and welcome the government's commitment to address human rights. Bahrain would like to offer Cuba the following recommendations. First, continue to develop e-government as a way to increase interaction between citizens and government at all levels. Second, continue to take measures to ensure the full protection of the rights of the elderly. The Kingdom of Bahrain wishes Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I now call on Bangladesh.
Madam Vice President, Bangladesh warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba and thanks for the presentation of National Report. We appreciate adoption of the new Constitution of Cuba and we commend Cuba for their continued cooperation with the UN human rights mechanisms. In spirit of cooperation, Bangladesh offers the following recommendations to Cuba. Intensify efforts to build awareness among workers about labor and social security rights. Take further measures to address all forms of violence against women and guarantee protection for victims, and continue to strengthen efforts to ensure equal access to quality education for all via the national education system. We wish Cuba success in its review. I thank you, Madam.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Barbados.
Thank you. I now call on Barbados.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We warmly welcome the delegation and commend the report, which highlights critical national initiatives and progress since the last cycle. We commend the comprehensive strategy on prevention and support in relation to gender-based and family violence and the adoption of the inclusive family code. We also take note of the implementation of the national program against racism and racial discrimination. We recommend 1, continue strengthening the legal and institutional framework to combat discrimination against women in the workplace and gender-based violence. And 2, we recommend fully bringing healthcare services to persons living with disabilities. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I now call on Belarus. Thank you, Vice President. We welcome the delegation of Cuba and thank them, and rather headed up by Mr. Baria, and thank them for presenting their national report. On the positive side, we note the large-scale legislative reforms undertaken by the Cuban authorities, which helped to strengthen the legal foundations for human rights protection. A key event in this context was the adoption of the new constitution, which was discussed in a transparent and inclusive spirit. We welcome efforts to raise living standards of the people and to ensure conditions for the further development of the country in spite of the illegal blockade, concerning which the overwhelming majority of UN member states have called for its lifting. We recommend that the country continue to bolster legal and institutional potential in this area of human rights in accordance with the new constitution, the National Plan for Economic and Social Development to 2030 and other policy documents. And second, that it further step up cooperation with international partners in the context of combating the blockade. Thank you.
Gracias,
Thank you. I give the floor to Belgium.
Mrs. Vice President, Belgium welcomes the progressive steps taken by the Cuban government in making its society more inclusive by adopting the new family code. My country, however, notes that since the last UPR, there has been a regression in the area of freedom of expression. Therefore, Belgium recommends to immediately and unconditionally release all those detained for exercising their right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, amend or repeal provision of the new penal code which stands to further limit freedom of expression, such as Article 143 and 120.1, establish legal framework fully guaranteeing the labor rights of journalists without restrictions, including the possibility of associating to create and work in an independent media outlets. In addition, Belgium recommends to enhance the capacity of protection and support services for women experiencing violence by providing...
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Bhutan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Bhutan thanks the delegation for the updates. We welcome the adoption of the new constitution and the enactment of many legislations since 2019. We note with appreciation the comprehensive reform of the criminal justice system and adoption of the national program against racism and racial discrimination, and many such other measures to promote and protect human rights despite the challenges faced by the country. We commend the commitment by Cuba to the universal provision of primary health care and free universal education. While noting the concerted efforts of the government, we recommend the following. 1. Continue to strengthen the training of public officials on human rights to ensure effective implementation of the adopted laws and policies. 2. Continue to strengthen the education system through allocation of additional resources, in particular rural areas. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias. Thank you. I give the floor to the plurinational state of Bolivia. Thank you, Vice President. Bolivia extends a fraternal welcome to the distinguished delegation of Cuba. We congratulate Cuba on its praiseworthy efforts to continue strengthening its institutional and normative framework for human rights despite the blockade and imposition of additional coercive measures which have an adverse effect on the enjoyment of human rights. We make the following recommendations: that it maintain free and universal access to the system of public health, that it continue efforts aimed at eliminating discrimination on the basis of gender, that it keep rejecting and denouncing the inclusion of Cuba on the list of countries sponsoring terrorism and shedding light thus on the harm done to human rights implied by the inclusion of this country in this illegal and unilateral list, that it continue decent treatment and humanitarian care provided to migrants in a situation of irregularity, and that it continue fostering participation by civil society in the follow-up and implementation of recommendations on human rights. We wish all success to Cuba. Thank you. I now call on Botswana.
Madam Vice President, Botswana welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba to this UPR session and thanks them for their comprehensive and informative national report. We commend Cuba for the strides made in advancing human development as well as promotion and protection of human rights. In particular, we commend the continued commitment by Cuba to the universal provision of primary health care. We similarly wish to commend Cuba on the ongoing third round of the improvement of national education system, which promotes participation by multiple sectors from the education sector. Going forward, Botswana recommends that Cuba, 1, implements measures to promote equitable access to health care services for all persons, including those living with disabilities. 2, take measures to promote universal enrollment in primary and secondary education. We wish Cuba a successful UPR outcome. I thank you, Madam President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Brazil.
Gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Thank you, Vice President. Brazil extends a warm welcome to Cuba in this UPR. We also congratulate them on the adoption of the new constitution in 2019, as well as the adoption of the family code, which recognizes same-sex marriages. We note with satisfaction the criminalization of racial discrimination and the new criminal code, and the adoption of the new national plan against racism. We recommend the following. First, that it strengthen the program for the distribution of food and production of food, and increase the health situation for women, children, and persons deprived of liberty. Second, that it continue to develop measures to combat gender violence and femicide. And we wish them all success in their UPR. Thank you. Thank you very much. I now call on Brunei Darussalam.
Thank you, Madam President. Brunei Darussalam thanks Cuba for the presentation of its national report. We commend Cuba for the progress it has made in its national plan for economic and social development to 2030, particularly in the area of digital transformation, which has seen growth in internet development and access. In this regard, Brunei Darussalam proposes 2 recommendations. 1, further promote quality, accessibility, and affordability of digital connectivity in Cuba. And 2, pursue efforts that will equip all areas of society with the skills and knowledge to participate in digital transformation, including through capacity building towards an inclusive digital society. Madam President, we wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Bulgaria.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Bulgaria welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks for the presentation of their national report. We commend the adoption of the new constitution, including the strengthening of women and girls' rights and the regard of protection of the environment. We remain concerned about the restrictions of freedom of expression and the right to peaceful assembly and association. Bulgaria recommends the following. 1, to consider legislative action to create a more pluralistic media environment in line with international standards. 2, to continue its efforts to improve the protection of women and children from violence through measures such as facilitating public spaces for debate on violence against women and girls and developing and approving a law on gender violence. We wish the delegation of Cuba a successful review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Burkina Faso. Thank you, Vice President. Burkina Faso welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for the progress achieved in the implementation of the recommendations resulting from its last review. My delegation notes the satisfaction in the adoption in 2019 of the new constitution and the introduction of legislative measures which strengthen the legal and institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights in a spirit of constructive cooperation, we recommend that it continue to implement programs against racism and racial discrimination, that it continue the effective implementation of the new family code, and third, that it continue to adopt measures to combat gender-based violence and sexist violence, and we wish them all success in their UPR. Thank you. I give the floor to Burundi. Thank you, Vice President. Burundi welcomes the distinguished Cuban delegation and takes note of the clear commitment of its government to the promotion of human rights. We commend the adoption of the policy related to integrating young people into the world of work and the establishment of a national commission to follow up on activities aimed at combating and eliminating once and for all vestiges of racism, racial prejudice, and racial discrimination. Burundi would like to take this opportunity to make 3 recommendations to Cuba. That is, that it continue the policy giving priority to the promotion of the right to education and health for all. Second, that it increase participation by women in all development spheres, including decision-making bodies. And third, that it pursue efforts aimed at ensuring respect for the Mandela rules and other international standards related to the treatment of prisoners. Thank you very much.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I now call on Cape Verde.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you. What is the problem? Thank you, Madam Vice President. Cape Verde welcomes the Cuban delegation and congratulates it on the presentation of the report. We congratulate Cuba on the remarkable progress made since the second cycle, and one of these is the new constitution, which has been adopted in a constructive spirit. We would like to make the following recommendations: that it abolish totally the death penalty, that it continue work against racism and racial discrimination so as to safeguard the progress already made in this area, to improve policies promoting women's inclusion in all decision-making levels, and lastly, that it try to reduce the death and mortality rate in natural disasters. We wish Cuba all success in the review.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now call on Cambodia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Cambodia warmly welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba and appreciate the presentation of the national report. We commend efforts made by Cuban authority in promoting human rights, achieving universal coverage in education, healthcare access, and addressing climate change despite challenges faces. In constructive spirit, we recommend: first, take additional steps to fully implement the National Development Plan, aiming to effectively promote economic and social development. Second, continue developing strategy to address climate change impacts for a more resilient society amidst escalating threat from cyclone. Finally, I wish the Cuba delegation successful review. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Cameroon. Thank you, Vice President. Cameroon congratulates the delegation of Cuba on presenting its report and welcomes its efforts to promote human rights, in particular the strengthening of the rights of women and the rights of vulnerable groups in its new constitution. We'd like in a constructive spirit to make the following recommendations: that it continue the training of workers in the education sector to instill in them values of respect, tolerance, non-violence, and non-discrimination based in particular on the color of one's skin. Second, that it continue to promote the participation by persons with disabilities in national development so as to ensure the implementation and strengthening of the legal framework protecting their rights. Third, that it intensify promotion of non-discrimination against minorities, women, and other vulnerable groups, including migrants. We wish all success to Cuba in its UPR. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Canada.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Canada welcomes the enhancement of rights afforded by the broader definition of family in the new Family Code, including through the strengthening of gender equality, the legalization of same-sex marriage, and same-sex adoption. Canada recommends that Cuba, 1, improve transparency and due process upon arrest and pretrial, as well as during sentencing hearings, especially for those detained for defending human rights during the July 11th, 2021 and other protests. 2, introduce amendments to the recent penal code to eliminate harassment, intimidation, and restrictions of NGOs, including of independent journalists, artists, academics, students, and opposition activists. And 3, ensure that internet access is not unduly hampered by the government due to unjustified usage controls, recognizing that Cubans have widely adopted the use of mobile technology in exercising the right of freedom of expression. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Chad via Zoom.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, President. Chad wishes to warmly welcome the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for its presentation of its national report for the fourth cycle. We see that there have been efforts made to improve its legal and institutional framework to protect human rights, to meet the needs of Cuban society, and to comply with international human rights standards in the spirit of a constructive dialogue. We would like to make the following recommendations. First, that it envisage ratifying the optional protocol to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Second, that it strengthen guarantees of rights for all members of the population, particularly the homeless members of the population. We wish Cuba all success in this UPR review. Thank you very much. Thank you. I now give the floor to Chile. Vice President, we welcome the delegation of Cuba. We thank them for presenting their national report and would like to highlight its efforts to raise to constitutional rank the prohibition of torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, with a view to making further progress in promoting and protecting human rights. We respectfully recommend, first, that Cuba move forward on ratifying the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Second, that it repeal the provisions of the Cuban Criminal Code that allow the death penalty to be carried out. Third, that the competence of military courts be amended so as to prevent them from dealing with cases in which civilians are involved. Fourth, that it take the requisite measures to ensure the right of all persons to freedom of assembly and peaceful association and expression. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Pakistan warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and commends the Foreign Minister for a comprehensive presentation of the national report. We extend our sincere felicitations on the promulgation of the new Constitution of the Republic of Cuba in 2019 and its adoption of new rights. We also appreciate Cuba's establishment of a National Commission for implementing the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2021. In the spirit of constructive engagement, my delegation recommends the following. First, maintain the momentum in improving the legal and institutional human rights framework. Secondly, further promote the rights of persons with disabilities, including through the National Action Plan and the work of the National Commission. And thirdly, continue to improve systems for early warning of natural disasters. We wish the government of Cuba a successful review. I thank you, madam.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Colombia. Thank you, Vice President. Colombia greets the distinguished delegation of Cuba headed up by His Excellency the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, and wishes it success in its presentation of its UPR. We thank Cuba for its role as a guarantor country for seeking peace in Colombia. In a constructive spirit, we recommend to Cuba that first, it continue moving forward in combating discrimination and violence against persons on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Second, that it make progress in its education programs to prevent teenage pregnancies. Thank you very much. Thank you. I now call on Congo. Vice President, the delegation of Congo extends a warm welcome to the delegation of Cuba and congratulates it on presenting its report. Congo applauds the adoption by Cuba of a new constitution with a broad spectrum of rights now being significantly protected. My country would also like to congratulate Cuba on its undeniable achievements in the protection of economic, social, and cultural rights, particularly in the areas of health and education. Against this backdrop, Congo would like to make the following recommendations. One, that it redouble efforts to ensure that older people are better integrated socially. And second, that it stand firm in increasing the supply of access to Internet. In conclusion, Congo wishes all success to Cuba on its UPR review. Thank you very much. I now call on Costa Rica. Thank you, Vice President. We'd like to welcome the delegation of Cuba and Minister Rodriguez and thank them for the presentation of the report. We value their efforts to combat discrimination and the efforts for digital transformation. We would respectfully recommend first that it guarantee in the constitutional framework full guarantees of peaceful assembly and to ensure that no one is imprisoned for demonstrating or exercising his rights. And second, that activists, journalists and human rights defenders of independent civil society can work without being exposed to any reprisals. Third, that it ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. And fourth, that it establish a national human rights commission in accordance with the Paris principles. We wish Cuba all success in its review. Thank you. I now call on Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you. Vice President, Côte d'Ivoire thanks the delegation of Cuba for presenting its report and congratulates it on the work done aimed at upholding its commitments to promoting and protecting human rights through measures undertaken to guarantee universal access to primary health care and free universal education, which have brought about a reduction of the infant child mortality rate and a literacy rate of 99.8%. The government of Côte d'Ivoire would like in a constructive spirit to make the following recommendations. First, that it bring the justice system for children in full compliance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And second, that it think of introducing an official moratorium on the death penalty with a view to abolishing it. Côte d'Ivoire wishes all success to Cuba on its review. Thank you very much. Thank you. I now call on Croatia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Croatia welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks them for the presentation of their report. We commend the adoption of the new constitution with the human rights category and the efforts in its implementation. We have following recommendations. 1. Ratify International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2. Ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. 3. Establish an independent national human rights institution in accordance with the Paris principles. 4. Codify torture as a specific offense and criminalize torture in accordance with the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. We wish Cuba a successful UPR session. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Cyprus has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Cyprus warmly welcomes the delegation from Cuba and thanks for the presentation of its national report. We acknowledge the adoption of the new constitution in 2019 as a positive step that has strengthened the legal institutional human rights framework through a participatory process. We encourage Cuba to continue its reform process in accordance with international human rights standards. Cyprus has the following recommendations: adoption of a comprehensive strategy to improve the protection and care of victims of gender-based violence, incorporation and harmonization of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities into national law, continue with the implementation of the Inclusive Family Code and operationalize the Family Ombudsman's Office established in 2023. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. The Czech Republic has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Czechia thanks Cuba for its involvement in the UPR process. We welcome the advancements in the new family code that reflect a significant step forward in upholding the rights of women and LGBTQI+ community. We wish to recommend that Cuba, 1. Allow human rights defenders, independent journalists and civil society organizations to exercise their right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association without restriction. 2. Constructively engage in multilateral human rights fora and act to protect, respect and fulfill human rights of all persons, including their right to a fair trial. 3. Implement the legislation to guarantee the free exercise of basic human rights established in the Constitution. 4. Issue and implement a standing invitation to all special procedures. We wish Cuba a successful UPR.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The PRK delegation warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and appreciates for its fourth national report. We commend the government of Cuba for its steadfast efforts and significant progress in the promotion and protection of human rights, despite economic and financial blockade imposed by the U.S. for decades that constitutes gross, flagrant, systemic violation of human rights of Cuban people. In this respect, we recommend following. 1. continue improving judicial system and preserving organic and functional independence of courts. 2, continue taking actions to ensure learning from old age about the Cuban political system and ways to actively participate in it. 3, continue strengthening the values of society and its unity around the Cuban political system. We wish Cuba a successful review. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to the delegation of Cuba, who will be addressing the observations and comments raised so far. Your Excellency, you have the floor. Thank you, Vice President. We would like to express our gratitude to the delegations that have taken the floor. In order to address some of the issues raised, we will now give the floor to 2 members of our delegation, beginning with Madam Marlene Triana Medeiros, General Director of Elementary Education of the Ministry of Education. After her, Madam Miriam Laubaldez, Advisor to the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. Marlene, you have the floor. Thank you, Minister. In July 2023, in Cuba, we approved the policy to provide comprehensive care for children, adolescents, and the youth in general, which benefits over 3,800,000 children, teenagers, and young people up until the age of 30. We have carried out specific actions to strengthen a comprehensive system for the protection and promotion of their rights, based on cross-cutting concepts such as gender, skin color, territory, sexual orientation and gender identity, disability, and others. We give the highest priority to addressing the vulnerabilities that could undermine the full development of boys, girls, adolescents, and the Cuban youth. We are expecting to approve the Child's and Youth's Code in December 2024. This will be a law in keeping with the social reality and the international commitments that Cuba has taken in this area. I would like to underscore that not a single boy, girl, or adolescent is excluded from the educational system on any grounds whatsoever. Education in Cuba is a constitutional right. It is free, accessible, and of high quality for all individuals throughout their lives. The general national education system is comprised of 10,817 educational institutions. Half of them are in the rural areas. There are 655 schools with enrollment below 5 students. The Cuban population has high levels of education. The state promotes artistic expression in all its manifestations, in keeping with the Constitution and with our laws. The right to education is one of the highest priorities for the Cuban state, and the figures are proof of this. Expenses in education account for 25% of the country's budget and 12.4% of the GDP. And this has been achieved in spite of the serious harm caused in the educational sector by the United States embargo. Just in 2022, conservative estimates are that the effects exceed $66 million. The negative impact of the embargo is noticeable in infrastructure, school, nutrition, the necessary bare necessities for studying and for lives, and the wages for teachers and professors. And as regards the subject of sexual and reproductive health, we provide free access, beginning with primary health care. Comprehensive education on responsible sexuality is a priority, and this is done with a human rights approach. The educational sector is an essential pillar in that goal. There are no age limits for adolescents to have free access to contraceptives or to emergency contraception. According to the figures provided by the Cuban Observatory on Gender Equality, 87.2% of Cuban women use some modern contraceptive method. There are no remarkable differences to be noted according to area of residence. Distinguished delegates, the Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, while paying a visit to Cuba last June, noted the deep human value of the Cuban experience in the alternative modalities for welcoming and providing thorough protection to children and adolescents. There are a total of 54 homes that welcome approximately 400 minors without family protection. And these homes are quite similar to a regular household in terms of the care and services provided, while considering the best interest of the child. 1 year after the adoption of the Family Code, over 200 boys, girls, and adolescents are welcomed by host families as an alternative to institutionalization. As regards child abuse, I would like to note that in Cuba, corporal punishment is prohibited, as well as humiliating treatment or inappropriate types of exerting discipline. Constitutionally, child and adolescent labor is banned. Exercising parental responsibility is based on respecting the dignity of children and adolescents as rights holders. Regarding violence and ill treatment in educational institutions, a subject broached by several delegations, I would like to note that the Ministry of Education has improved its monitoring system on this matter. Cases of this nature lead to the definitive removal of the individual and a corresponding criminal sanction to anyone perpetrating them. Thank you. Thank you, Minister. I would like to address several matters raised by some delegations. In Cuba, the right to work has a constitutional standing. Currently, over 4,500,000 people are employed. Approximately 3 million of them work for the state, and 1,609,000 work in the non-state sector. Women represent 38% of those employed. Unemployment rate is a mere 1.8%. In 2021, the Dignified Work Program was approved in order to promote access to quality employment, the reduction of the informal sector, and to provide sustainability to the Social Security system. We will continue to make headway in developing different ways of non-state management, including in the private sector. During the COVID-19 pandemic, 36 different measures were approved, and they were aimed at providing safety and protection in the employment sector, as well as that of wages and Social Security. In September of 2023, we approved a protocol of action to address situations of discrimination, violence, and harassment in the workplace. Currently, it is in its implementation stage. We protect and call for a respectful and inclusive work environment. We guarantee equal opportunities and the respect for the dignity of all individuals. We prevent discrimination, violence, and harassment in the workplace, and we punish those responsible for such acts. Dear delegates, the state of Cuba guarantees the protection to the worker and his or her family through the social protection system. They are protected, or over 1,738,000 people are protected by the Social Security system, and social assistance benefits over 187,000 households, providing services, and cash. In 2024, we will update the Labor Code and the Law on Social Security. And this will be preceded by consultations with workers, with beneficiaries in a democratic dialogue and a participatory one in the country. Workers voluntarily join trade union organizations, and 79.8% of workers are unionized. Over 2 million in the state sector, and over 117,000 in the new sectors of the economy. Now I would like to speak about the care provided to persons with disabilities. The state of Cuba has taken great strides in order to protect and guarantee their rights. In 2020, we updated the policy to improve care and services provided to persons with disabilities. We promote their inclusion in rehabilitation programs and the development of social and work-related skills. In 2021, we put together the National Commission to follow up on the international commitments taken on by Cuba in the area of the rights of persons with disabilities. It is led by a Vice Prime Minister of the government. There are several civil society organizations that associate persons with disabilities who actively participate in the consultation and political decision-making processes. At the behest of the Cuban civil society, in June last, the Cuban Association for Persons with Intellectual Disabilities was created, and in our eyes, this represents another noteworthy advance. The protection of older persons is a constitutional right in Cuba. Their comprehensive care includes the promotion of their active participation in the social and community life, as well as access to culture, to education, and personal flourishing, specialized medical care, and social protection. The goal is to continue to raise the standard of living and the well-being of these people as much as possible. Thank you. I would like to thank the delegation for their statements, and now we will continue with our list of speakers, beginning with Djibouti. Thank you, Vice President. Djibouti would like to welcome the high-level delegation of Cuba and thank them for the presentation of the national report. My delegation welcomes the many legal reforms as well as strengthening the regulatory framework set up by Cuban authorities, mainly through the approval of the new constitution in 2019, which includes a category of human rights. Djibouti would also like to present the following recommendations to Cuba. First, to continue efforts aimed at the economic and social development in order to eliminate poverty and to further improve the standard of living of the population. Secondly, to continue the effective implementation of measures to combat violence against women in keeping with the global prevention strategy and the combating of gender-based violence and family violence. Lastly, Djibouti wishes every success to Cuba during this review. Thank you. Thank you. The Dominican Republic is recognized. Thank you, Vice President. The delegation of the Dominican Republic would like to greet the delegation of Cuba, led by their distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we would like to express our appreciation to them for the presentation of their fourth national report. In a constructive spirit, we would like to recommend, first, to continue to take measures to eliminate stereotypes grounded on the roles, the functions, and the responsibilities of women in society and in the household. Secondly, to improve access of persons with disabilities to tourist areas or areas of historical interest in order to promote tourism accessible for all. And third, to continue to develop constructive cooperation with the human rights instruments of the United Nations of a universal nature. We wish Cuba a successful UPR. Thank you. Ecuador is recognized. Madam Vice President, Ecuador would like to warmly welcome the delegation of Cuba and to thank them for the report. We highlight the approval of the Family Code of 2022. With all due respect, we would like to recommend, 1, to ensure that cases of gender violence are duly investigated, providing comprehensive reparations for victims. 2, to prevent and put an end to acts of harassment, intimidation, threats, and disqualification of human rights defenders, journalists, artists, and their families. And 3, to harmonize legislation on the media and radio broadcasting, the internet and cybersecurity with international rules on the freedom of expression. Ecuador wishes Cuba a successful review. Thank you. Thank you. Egypt has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. We should like to thank the delegation of Cuba for its comprehensive presentation. My delegation appreciates the constitutional and legislative reforms that the Cuban government has been implementing since the last review for the promotion and protection of human rights. We express appreciation for the adoption of national programs and strategies to combat racism and racial discrimination, empower women, and combat domestic violence, promote the rights of persons with disabilities. We recommend the following: continue the implementation of policies that promote preventive approaches and reintegration of inmates in their communities, continue to exchange experiences and disseminate best practices regarding the treatment of prisoners and conditions of detention, developing training activities related to the implementation of natural resources and environmental law in order to promote the enjoyment of clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. 4th, protecting the country's artistic heritage. 5th, continue to confront politicization of human rights in various international forums. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. El Salvador has the floor. Vice President, we laud the progress that Cuba has made since the adoption of the new constitution, which recognizes the best interests of the child and reforms of the justice system. Constructively, we recommend to continue to implement specific measures to guarantee the effective implementation of the comprehensive policy on youth adolescents, and to conclude updating the Code of Youth and Children. 2, to continue efforts on access to information, technologies, and communication, particularly access to internet and e-government. 3rd, to continue to strengthen Cuba's cooperation with the human rights system of the United Nations. We wish Cuba a success in this new UPR cycle. Thank you. Thank you. Equatorial Guinea has the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Vice President. The delegation of Equatorial Guinea would like to commend the delegation of the government of the Sister Republic of Cuba in their review of human rights at the UPR, and we would like to laud the progress that they have made since the last UPR review. We recommend, first, to consider the possibility of increasing the number of agreements of the International Labor Organizations ratified by Cuba. 2, to continue to provide assistance and the necessary training to people that so requested in prisons. 3, to increase access to internet in rural areas and for vulnerable people. And 4th, to continue to promote the rights of all persons to enjoy a free and balanced environment as mentioned in the Constitution. Thank you very much, and we wish success to the Republic of Cuba. Thank you. Eritrea is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Eritrea warmly welcomes the high-level Cuban delegation headed by Minister Bruno Rodriguez Barilla and wishes to make the following 5 recommendations. Ensure compliance with the labor rights of workers in the non-state sector and take measures according to established laws. Safeguard the remarkable progress made in the areas of health, education, and fight against discrimination and inequalities. Continue to strengthen the criminal protection offered to citizens by national legislation. Continue to improve the early warning systems reached to the population on disaster risk reduction. Increase training programs on human rights to all sectors, especially for law enforcement agents and public officials. We wish Cuba every success. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la...
Thank you. Estonia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Estonia welcomes the adoption of the new constitution and the reforms undertaken. We note with appreciation the strengthening of women's and girls' rights, including steps taken to combat domestic violence and efforts made to improve gender equality. However, we are deeply concerned about reports of aggression and harassment against journalists, media workers, activists, and human rights defenders. Estonia recommends to Cuba to ratify the ICCPR and both its optional protocols, ratify the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, declare a moratorium on the use of death penalty, ensure everyone's right to freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly and association, and freedom of movement, including for civil society representatives, journalists, media workers, and human rights defenders. We wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. Ethiopia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Ethiopia warmly welcomes the high-level delegation of Cuba to the 44th session of the UPR Working Group. We thank the delegation for its comprehensive national report and the oral update today. Ethiopia commends Cuba for implementing the recommendations received during the previous UPR cycles and concrete measures taken by the government of Cuba to strengthen its national human rights institutions. In a spirit of constructive engagement and dialogue, Ethiopia recommends 3. 1. Continue first to guarantee the exercise of civil and political rights in accordance with national legislations and international instruments to which Cuba is a party. 2. Improve existing mechanism to promote the participation of young people in all social, economic, and cultural matters of the country, and continue providing solidarity aid to other countries affected by disasters, as well as sharing experience and knowledge in this area.
Gracias.
Thank you. Fiji, via video, has the floor.
He welcomes and congratulates the delegation of Cuba for the presentation of its report. As the fellow says, Fiji understands the unique human rights challenges arising from the devastating impacts of climate change and natural disasters, and commends the government's efforts in strengthening its policy frameworks to address this. Fiji offers the following recommendations. 1. Intensify efforts to develop and strengthen the necessary legislative frameworks that address cross-sectoral environmental challenges, including climate change and disaster risk reduction frameworks, with the full, effective, and meaningful participation of persons in marginalized groups and in vulnerable situations. And 2. Enhance support services for victims of gender-based violence and take measures to raise awareness among relevant stakeholders of the specific needs and vulnerabilities of women and children who are victims of domestic and gender-based violence. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Finland has the floor.
Madam Vice President, Finland welcomes the engagement of Cuba in the UPR. In line with our previous recommendations, we recommend the following. First, ratify without delay the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Second, draft and implement a comprehensive law against gender-based violence and ensure the effective exercise of civil and political rights of women. Third, repeal laws that restrict freedom of expression and association and bring the legal framework in line with international standards. Finland wishes Cuba a successful UPR review. I thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. France has the floor. Thank you. Vice President, France would like to welcome the Cuban delegation and to thank them for the report. We welcome the adoption of a new family code. However, we regret several provisions of the new criminal code. France recommends that Cuba, first, ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. 2, to ratify the optional protocol of the Convention of the United Nations Against Torture. 3, to abolish the death penalty. 4, to guarantee the independence of the judiciary, the right to a fair trial and access to justice. 5th, to protect the free exercise of the professional activities of artists, journalists, and human rights defenders. And 6th and last, to guarantee effective freedom of expression, assembly, and association. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la
Thank you. Gabon has the floor. Thank you, Vice President. The delegation of Gabon would like to welcome the delegation of Cuba to this review and thank them for the presentation of the report. We take note with satisfaction of the adoption of a new constitution in 2019, which has allowed Cuba to further improve its legal institutional framework in the area of human rights and in other areas. Particularly, we welcome the adoption of laws and strategies to promote women. Gabon encourages this trend. In a constructive spirit, we encourage to further pursue awareness-raising campaigns as part of the promotion of gender equality and the fight against gender-based violence. We wish that Cuba's review is crowned with success. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Gambia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The Gambia extends a warm welcome to the distinguished delegation of Cuba and thank them for the report presented today. We commend Cuba for its proactive measures in promoting and protecting human rights and welcome the adoption of initiatives like the National Program Against Racism and Racial Discrimination. Madam Vice President, we have the following recommendations for the delegation of Cuba. 1, to advance its educational efforts through the national education system to ensure quality and inclusive education for all. 2, to deliberate on adopting the remaining international human rights instruments to ensure a robust and all-encompassing human rights framework. 3, to uphold the rights and welfare of its minority populations and to address matters related to their representation and guarantee unhindered access to fundamental services. We wish the delegation a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Georgia.
Georgia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Georgia welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks His Excellency Minister Parilla for the presentation of the national report. Georgia positively assesses work carried out for the protection of the rights of the children and youth, in particular adoption of the policy on comprehensive support for children, adolescents and youth in 2023. We also value Cuba's efforts to promote the rights of people with disabilities, including the establishment of the Association of Persons with Intellectual Disabilities. Having said that, with this, Georgia would like to recommend to Cuba. First, to reinforce efforts aimed at preventing and combating gender-based and domestic violence. And second, to speed up the implementation of the National Action Plan on support for persons with disabilities. We wish the delegation of Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Germany.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Germany welcomes the delegation of Cuba. We commend the country for its determined dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and the new family code. However, Germany remains deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Cuba, particularly civil and political rights. Germany therefore recommends Cuba to 1, ratify without further delay the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. 2, fully cooperate with human rights mechanisms as well as civil society organizations and human rights defenders, granting them full access to Cuba, including to prisons and detention centers. 3, release without delay all those still imprisoned over the protest of 11 July 2021 and all other political detainees. And 4, ensure freedom of assembly, of opinion and the press and create a favorable climate for independent civil society, including by adequately amending inter alia Articles 143 and 120 of the Cuban Penal Code. Germany wishes Cuba a successful UPR. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ghana.
Madam Vice President, Ghana welcomes the delegation of Cuba to the UPR process and thanks them for the presentation of their national report. We applaud the continuous efforts made by Cuba to strengthen and improve legal institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights, and further commend Cuba for the adoption of a new constitution in 2019 that aims to enhance the promotion and protection of human rights of all Cubans. Ghana makes the following recommendations to Cuba. 1, to consider acceding to the OPCAT. 2, mainstream a gender perspective in all policies and strategies to combat racial discrimination against women of African descent. And 3, consider declaring a formal moratorium on the death penalty with a view to abolish it in the future. We wish Cuba every success with the review process. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Greece.
Gracias, señora vicepresidenta.
Thank you. Madam Vice President, we'd like to welcome the delegation of Cuba. Greece backs the advances of Cuba in the areas of non-discrimination, gender support, and the rights of children. We recommend that Cuba ensure appropriate investigations into accusations of harassment and persecution of human rights defenders, and that you protect victims of gender violence, providing specialized personnel and infrastructure, strengthening training on gender-based violence for prosecutors and judges, and continue to improve labor legislation and those conditions that are favorable for union activities, protecting thus the rights of workers. We wish the delegation of Cuba a successful UPR review. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Honduras. Thank you. Vice President, we hail the delegation of Cuba
led by their Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we support the new legislation supporting human rights of all individuals and your ongoing efforts to strengthen economic, social, and cultural rights despite the economic, trade, and financial blockade of the United States. We also hail other laws to support the protection of the rights of workers. Honduras would like to offer the following recommendations. 1, continue to document and report the negative effects of unilateral coercive measures on human rights, and 2, redouble efforts to ensure gender equality, including educational policies and communication in this area. We wish you a successful UPR. Thank you. Thank you. I give the floor to Iceland. How amazing is it that...
Madam Vice President, Iceland welcomes the delegation of Cuba and its national report. Iceland recommends the following. 1, abolish the death penalty. 2, ratify the optional protocol to CEDAW. 3, scale up public awareness campaigns to promote equality, combat gender-based violence and dismantle stereotypes. 4, investigate all cases of gender-based and domestic violence, hold perpetrators to account and ensure redress. 5, implement Resolution 16/2021, which establishes the program for comprehensive sexuality education in the national education system. I wish Cuba also success for its review. I thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to India.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. India warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks for its presentation. India appreciates the commendable work done by Cuba for adopting the national programs against racism and racial discrimination and advancement of human rights. We welcome the adoption of the new constitution of the Republic of Cuba, which was made through a referendum and includes several provisions related to human rights, thereby strengthening legal and institutional mechanisms. India appreciates Cuba for the enactment of legislations on food and nutritional security and family court to protect rights of women, child, people with disabilities and other groups, and in the spirit of constructive engagement, recommends Cuba to effectively implement these legislations. We wish the delegation of Cuba all success. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Indonesia.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Indonesia warmly welcomes the distinguished Foreign Minister of Cuba and his delegates and thank the delegation for their national report. We commend the adoption of the new constitution of Cuba in 2019 that provides stronger and more comprehensive protection of human rights. In a constructive spirit, we wish to recommend 1, take step forward aligning its national human rights institution to the Paris Principle, and 2, ensure that the safeguards for recognizing, respecting, and protecting the freedom of religion within the Constitution are implemented through national as well as local legal frameworks and policy. Finally, we wish Cuba a successful review. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. I give the floor to Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Warmly welcome the delegation of Cuba and thanks to the delegation for the presentation of the national report. Azerbaijan appreciates the commitment of Cuba to the UPR process and the efforts to further protect human rights. We praise the practical steps in many fields, including the right to equality and non-discrimination, education, combating human trafficking, as well as the rights of specific persons and groups. We recommend Cuba, first, continue making the necessary efforts to protect the rights of workers, including those in the private sector. Second, continue protecting and guaranteeing economic, social and cultural rights and the right to development. Third, strengthen programs to benefit the elderly, in particular the National Program of Comprehensive Care for the Elderly. Azerbaijan wishes Cuba a very successful review. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to Iraq.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. The delegation of Iraq welcomes the head and members of the delegation of the Republic of Cuba and appreciates its effort in preparing its 4th report. We welcome the efforts made by Cuba to promote and ensure the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms through the advancement of a legal institutional framework commensurate with the standards of human rights and the needs of the Cuban society. It also welcomes continuing measures to improve health services improve the quality of education, combat trafficking in person, protect victims, enhance the role of women, increase participation in decision-making. We recommend continue efforts to improve quality of the national system of artistic and sports education at all levels. Second, continue to strengthen independence of judges and lawyers in line with with Cuba's international obligations. In conclusion, thank you.
Tiene la palabra.
I give the floor to Ireland.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Madam Vice President. Ireland welcomes the Cuban delegation and acknowledges progress made since the last UPR, including the adoption of the Family Code in 2022, which bolstered equality and LGBTQI+ rights. We also welcome the upcoming visit of the EU Special Representative for Human Rights. Ireland is concerned by the detention of civilians for exercising freedom of peaceful assembly, association, opinion and expression, and by provisions in the new penal code that may further limit these freedoms. Ireland recommends 1. Release those detained for exercising their freedoms of peaceful assembly and expression. 2. Amend provisions of the penal code that criminalize defamation and limit freedom of opinion and expression online and offline. And 3. Repeal Article 176 of the Cuban Penal Code. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. Italy has the floor, and they will be joining us by video.
Mr. President, Italy welcomes the promulgation of the new Cuban constitution in 2019 and recognizes the efforts made by the Cuban government to improve the normative and institutional framework for the protection of human rights. Italy seizes this opportunity to offer Cuba the following recommendations. Consider ratifying the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Fully abolish the death penalty. Guarantee freedom of opinion and expression online and offline and the right to peaceful assembly. Safeguard the free and independent activity of human rights defenders and journalists without any prejudice and any legal and penal consequence for their activity. Continue the process of social and economic reforms. We wish Cuba a successful review.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Montenegro.
I give the floor to Montenegro.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Montenegro welcomes the distinguished delegation of Cuba. Montenegro welcomes the adoption of the new constitution of Cuba in 2019 and the inclusion of the category of human rights for the first time. We commend the prohibition of any discrimination on the grounds of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, and the promotion of gender equality under the new constitution. We note with concern the reports of coercive practices during interrogations, including incommunicado detention following the 2021 protests, particularly of children. Montenegro recommends 1. To establish protocols regulating the conduct of law enforcement officials during social protests in conformity with international standards. 2. To introduce the necessary legislative amendments to remove the jurisdiction of the military courts over civilians. And 3. To take effective and affirmative measures to ensure the employment of persons with disabilities, particularly women in the public and private sectors. We wish Cuba a successful UPR cycle. I thank you.
Gracias. El último.
Thank you. Mali is the last speaker on my list. They will be joining us by Zoom. Thank you, Madam Vice President. I would like to first offer a warm welcome to the delegation of Cuba. We hail your presence in this UPR review. My delegation would like to commend more than half the budget being allocated to health, as well as other support for the youth and primary health care. We hail the creation of the National Office to protect persons that are vulnerable and persons with disabilities. In the area of the rights to labor protection in other areas, there is an effort to support vulnerable people. We recommend that Cuba work to uphold the protection of the rights of the child. Thank you. Thank you. Distinguished participants, that was my last speaker. I now give the floor again to the delegation of Cuba so that they might offer observations and comments, as well as final, that is to say, concluding observations. Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. I also would like to express my appreciation for the remarks and statements that have been made. I offer the floor to Mr. Luis Emilio Cadaval from the Ministry of the Interior, and subsequently Mr. Dixon Fuentes Guzman, the representative of the Prosecutor General's Office. Then I will offer brief concluding remarks. Thank you, please.
Gracias, compañero ministro.
Thank you, Minister. Allow me to refer to a topic that has been mentioned by numerous delegations. In Cuba, we have prohibited arbitrary detention. Detentions are conducted in step with criminal procedural guarantees and due process. The law sets forth procedures and circumstances that can lead to detention. It also sets forth the conditions in which a detained must be held as a precautionary measure, the conditions for which, that is to say, there must be charges or the person must be released. There are no clandestine detention centers in Cuba. The detention centers are publicly known, and they are, and information is provided to the public on these sites. In all detention centers, there are automated registries. This helps family members or any other party to know in what installation and under what charges an individual, an alleged and a detainee finds themselves. As regards activists and alleged human rights defenders, they have been sanctioned. They are held when they have been accused of laws. There are no political prisoners. No one is persecuted for their ideological stance or political motivations. As regards our penitentiary system, we can note that the ongoing improvements of these systems is a priority. We have deployed many efforts to allow for living conditions that are dignified in these centers, and this in step with international standards. Cuba is working in step with the Mandela rules and the Bangkok rules and others aimed at ensuring appropriate treatment of inmates and detainees. In the penitentiary centers, there is no discrimination. Everyone receives the same care, including those that are imprisoned for serious crimes. Everyone has access to education, culture, recreation, and religious support when voluntarily requested by the inmates. Despite material difficulties, we ensure free medical attention to the prison population, and this with the same standards as the rest of our population. The national healthcare system is available to the inmates whenever they require specialized medical care. Further, in the penitentiary system, there are 700 doctors, 146 nurses, and they have the resources and medications necessary for their direct and immediate attention. 40% of the prison population is in training programs, working with employers to provide them opportunities for employment and social reinsertion. More than 34% are involved in some institutional labor activity, and always on a voluntary basis. There is no forced labor in our penitentiaries. As regards migration, in the last period, we have seen an increase in Cuban immigration. This has adverse consequences on the nation, economically and demographically. This is directly linked to the stepping up of the U.S. blockade and the privileged treatment that is provided for political reasons to Cubans arriving to the U.S. borders regardless of the way in which they arrive. It is impossible to understand the nature of Cuban migratory flows to countries of the region headed to the United States without considering the weight of these factors. These are used to destabilize, it's a brain drain, and it discredits Cuba. It is also clear that this has a disfavorable impact on other countries in our areas when Cuban migrants in irregular migration flows use unsafe and dangerous routes or are victims of organized crime. Cuba reiterates its commitment to a regular, safe, and orderly migratory flow This is in the hands of the United States administration. They must to modify the structural causes of the majority of Cuban migration, regular and irregular. And there has been support for the processes of national return by the migratory authorities of other countries. In the last 5 years, there have been more than 7,000 there has been a 7,000 increase for a total of 3,778. Between 2018 and March 2023, there has been assistance in Cuba for more than 5,767 migrants, irregular migrants from other countries. During their stay in the national territory, they received necessary care, including medical care. They are guaranteed safe return and voluntary return to their countries. We provide fair and dignified treatment to asylum seekers in our country, and we maintain close cooperation with the High Commissioner on Refugees. Thank you very much. Distinguished delegates, I would like to refer to numerous items that have been mentioned by delegations. In Cuba, in a state of social justice, criminal procedures unfold with strict adherence to legality. We have completely prohibited torture and cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. There are no criminal procedures nor individuals accused or punished in our country for acts of this nature. The Constitution, laws, and the actions taken by authorities protect our citizens from this type of conduct. Yes, we are very concerned over the documented case of torture that that take place in the Guantanamo Naval Base in the illegally occupied Cuban territory in that detention center. In Cuba, penitentiary establishments and detention centers are institutions that show respect and guarantees for the rights of all individuals. Between 2018 and 2023, the prosecutor handled more than 6,400 inspections of penitentiaries. These are aimed at guaranteeing that adequate and appropriate detention conditions are being offered and that there is enjoyment of rights by those deprived of liberty. The prosecutor's office has interviewed inmates on the protection of their rights and guarantees, as well as hearing their complaints and petitions and reports. These cases are investigated on a case-by-case basis, and when there are violations detected, there is an effort to reestablish the upholding and enjoyment of rights. Distinguished delegates, these individuals are held responsible. Also, in Cuba, we saw over the last 5 years 144 penitentiary officials punished for excesses in their functions. Of them, 76 were investigated by the military prosecutor's office, and 3 criminal convictions, and 14 disciplinary or administrative measures were handed down. As regards pardoning, we'd like to note that between 2011 and 2019, there have been 9,900 individuals covered by this. We have a national comprehensive system for the promotion and protection of human rights that has shown to be a guarantor with concrete, tangible results. As a part of this system, the prosecutor's office has in its remit the investigation and response to reports, complaints made by the citizens. Should there be violations of the law, then resolutions are handed down, and these are compulsory, and they seek to ensure the rapid restoration of the law. Since the previous review, the prosecutors have addressed more than 600,000 individuals, and they received more than 100,000 complaints. Of them, 11,000 were regarding inmates or their family members. Cuba also saw that there were violations of legality in more than 12,800 cases, and personalized care was offered to restore the rights that were undermined. The system has showed to be effective and appropriate in its response to complaints regarding human rights violations. Distinguished delegates, to conclude, I'll refer to the implementation of provisional imprisonment in Cuba between 2018 and 2020. The matters brought before the tribunals in provisional custody trended downwards. There was a drop of 50% of cases into 2022 compared to 2018. In the majority of these have to do with very serious crimes such as murder, homicide, drug trafficking, corruption of minors, illicit trafficking in migrants, trafficking in persons, inter alia. This is in step with that established by law. Thank you very much. Madam Vice President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I should like first to thank the more than 140 delegations that have taken the floor in today's session. 144, I believe. We are pleased that the great majority of the recommendations proposed are in step with the spirit of constructive dialogue and cooperation that should reign in the UPR. I would like to also express our gratitude. Thank you for the expressions recognizing Cuba's progress. We take on board this as an incentive to continue to work to uphold human rights and overcome the challenges that we have ahead. One delegation called for us to not address bilateral matters. The blockade by the United States against Cuba is not in any way a bilateral affair. Rather, it is a serious violation of international law. This is because of the scope, which is aggressively extraterritorial. As has been expressed this morning by numerous delegations, this illegal blockade is a massive, systematic, and flagrant violation of human rights of Cubans. This criminal policy should be brought to an end already or now, as has been almost unanimously been called for by the UNGA. Some statements note a lack of objective information on the reality in Cuba. We invite you to visit Cuba. We invite you to get to know firsthand our country. As always happens, a small few have sought to take advantage of this exchange to undermine the spirit of the UPR with politicized, meddlesome rhetoric on human rights and alleged recommendations that lack credibility. Unfortunately, the issue of human rights has become anew a political weapon used by powerful countries seeking to impose their political stripes on other countries, almost always in the South. Madam Vice President, we will continue to hone and bolster our democracy, which is genuinely participative and inclusive. We'll work to create a growing participation of our youth in the political, economic, social, and cultural processes in our nation. We will not fail to address every day with a goal of changing all that must be changed. Cuban civil society is and has been and continues to be part and parcel of the promotion and protection of human rights. I would like to express our deep appreciation and recognition to the representatives of our pluralistic, diverse, and vibrant civil society in Cuba. They have participated here in person in this exercise, and those that have also participated in the preparation of this. Your meaningful participations enrich our national report presented today. Allow me to conclude, Madam Vice President, by thanking as well you, the Secretariat, and this Human Rights Council. Please know that you can always count on Cuba when it comes to defending and developing multilateralism, cooperation, and dialogue. Much obliged. I thank His Excellency, the Foreign Minister, and the entirety of the delegation of Cuba. Thank you, Minister Rodriguez Parrilla. Thank you for your participation in this. The report will be drafted by the members of the Troika, Nepal, Benin, and Argentina. This will be in step with the process in place since 2015. The recommendations section will be distributed, and its adoption will be considered that same day. The complete report, including the summary section, will be distributed by email on the 24th of November, 2023. Before concluding the meeting, I would like to also thank the interpreters for their work today. We will meet again this afternoon at 3:30 for Tuvalu, Germany, Djibouti, Canada, and Bangladesh. We thus draw to an end and adjourn this UPR working group. Thank you.